Hello wrestling fans. The Pro Wrestle Machine is back with another request. This time it's the Von Erichs. Let's dive in, starting with the piece that Uncle Dave titled Death of a Dynasty. Death of a Dynasty. Somewhere along the way, a cute marketing concept decayed into a macabre body count. Irvin Mushnick, Penthouse magazine. In a 1988 article, Born Again, bashing about the Von Erich family, I was shocked that Kerry killed himself. But I wasn't shocked at all that he died. Terry Sims, pro wrestler and one of Kerry's closest friends. Fantasy versus reality. For most people in the real world, for the most part, they know the difference. In pro wrestling, among both its performers and its fans, sometimes the line gets a little blurred. Often that's dismissed as simply harmless. But sometimes when the line is blurred for long enough, or the difference is no longer perceptible, or even worse, when the fantasy becomes the reality, it creates a situation of potential danger. The danger is that the day may come when the bubble is burst and the fantasy is over and one isn't equipped to deal with the reality. The bubble must have come close to bursting several times over the past decade for Kerry Gene Atkinson, who had lived in many ways the ultimate fantasy life up until he was in his mid-20s. The reality after that period was the harshest imaginable. 3 brothers died. His other brothers suffered a near-death experience. One of his brother's children died at birth. He was involved in a motorcycle accident that left him crippled. The company that was his by birthright went out of business, ending with him having little money left to his name. The superstardom that was seemingly his not only by birthright but through ability and charisma as well, slowly slipped away. Because he was broke, he hooked up with the biggest wrestling company in the world, and for a time, he was getting to relive his past fame. But in doing so, they originally planned to take away his beloved family name. While he kept his name, the legendary status of it and favored treatment the name Von Erich meant were no longer the case. Slowly the reality that he wasn't what he once was moved him from superstar to preliminary status. The recreational drug problems continued. Soon the drugs that created his beloved physique were banned as well, causing his beloved muscles to shrink to ungodlike normality. Eventually, he lost the job as well and the money that went with it, and was only working once or twice a week, earning the kind of money that he often blew nightly during his years of living the ultimate fantasy, on good times. He was broke, and was in trouble with the IRS to the point that he was auctioning off his wrestling memorabilia from his famous title win over Ric Flair at wrestling conventions. His parents, a cornerstone behind the so-called perfect family unit, split up. His own marriage had its ups and downs. Yet in his own way, he was able to somehow shield himself, at least to a point, from reality by drawing upon the fantasy. The fantasy was that he was Kerry Von Erich, the modern-day warrior. He was one of the great athletes in the world. He had the perfect physique. He was nearly unbeatable at wrestling, and in fact, was the uncrowned world champion. He was the second youngest man ever to hold the most famous and prestigious wrestling belt in the world, and he won it from the greatest wrestler of our time in the most emotional setting and in front of one of the biggest crowds, and in one of the most famous matches the wrestling world had ever seen. He was loaded with charisma. He'd have gone to the Olympics in the discus if Carter hadn't called for the boycott, or if some hill wouldn't have stomped on his shoulder just before the tryouts that in reality he was never going to attend in the first place. He was rich. He had the hottest car. He could literally do no wrong, because even if he did, since he was a Von Erich, it would always be taken care of. Whatever he wanted, someone would take care of for him because he was Kerry Von Erich, son of the greatest wrestler the world had ever seen and son of one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the community. He was the object of desire for every female in the state of Texas, and plenty in other states as well. Everyone else wanted to be his friend. Anywhere he went he was mobbed by autograph seekers. Every night he stepped into the ring, the cheers were as loud for him as nearly anyone in the history of a business that was his. He was born to be a demigod. Hell, he was a demigod. At least he was every night when he stepped into the ring in the minds of most of the people in the building and to enough hangers-on out of the ring that he was able to never have to leave the fantasy. He was born into the perfect Christian family, inherited the greatest athletic genes, and through his never-ending search for athletic perfection, achieved dizzying heights of fame. He and his brothers were going to rule the wrestling world. On Wednesday, February 17th, the fantasy world of Kerry Von Erich was about to end. He was indicted that morning on cocaine possession charges stemming from a January 13th arrest. He was already serving 10 years probation for forging drug prescriptions during a time about 1 year earlier when he was supposed to be attending rehab. While it was not a guarantee, the odds were very good that his probation would be revoked and he would be sent to prison. It appears Kerry at least believed that was going to be his future. In prison, there would be no evenings where hundreds of women would screech every time he took off his ring jacket. No women would send him roses and fantasize or realize time with him. There were no world title matches to be won. No ugly heels were going to sell big when he said discus. No family left. The drugs that made him a modern-day warrior, the steroids, weren't going to be available. The drugs he took, just because they were available and plentiful, and the ones he took to numb both the physical and mental pain, were going to be gone. The drugs he took to escape from the reality were also going to be history. He could no longer rely on traits that had been instilled in him at a young age because the marks would always believe Von Erich because they fought the fans' fantasy enemies, nor have everyone that surrounded him believe he was something that he wasn't. Perhaps the worst thing of all was he'd have to come to grips with the fact that the fantasy that was his professional life and became much of his personal life wasn't reality. He'd have to face what the reality really was. The night of his death, a longtime family friend theorized that if Carey hadn't have taken his life that afternoon, he would have almost certainly done so in his first week in prison. When he learned Thursday morning of his indictment, he apparently set out to kill himself. But those who knew him well, or even casually, seemed to believe this wasn't a spontaneous decision. Many of his friends recalled in the past few days Carey would come over, for seemingly no reason, hug them, say I love you, and then leave. Some were confused by his actions initially. In hindsight, they realized he had been saying his goodbyes. It may have seemed unusual, but unusual in Carey's case wasn't unusual. Terry Funk, who saw Von Erich a few weeks earlier in Philadelphia, remembered him coming up to him and reminiscing about when he and his brothers feuded with Terry and his brother in Amarillo during the early days of his career, talking about it being some of the happiest moments of his life. On January 27, 1 week before his 33rd birthday, he and his probation office, Gary Hunter, had their routine meeting and he talked of suicide. He talked about it then, Hunter said in an article in the Dallas Morning News. He said he missed his brothers and said he just didn't feel like going on. Hunter said Carey rejected his advice to seek counseling for his suicidal feelings and his continuing drug addictions. In his own way, he came to say goodbye to me on Monday, remembered Terry Sims, a Dallas wrestler who was one of his best friends. He came into the health club, hugged me and said, I miss you and you're not around. It bothered me for a couple of days because it was really strange. His hair wasn't combed. He hadn't shaved. He looked terrible. I'm sure that everyone he came in contact with the last 2 weeks thought the same thing. He didn't want to go to prison. He had told people that if he got indicted, he'd kill himself. Is prison really that bad? So he may have had to spend a year in prison. It may have been the best thing that ever happened to him. He had 2 daughters that he loved deeply. Anyone who was ever around him could tell that in a second. His father said Carey had frequently mentioned taking his own life. His wife Kathy, whom he had an on-again, off-again relationship with over the years, had all the guns from the house. He said the same strange goodbyes to the woman and her mother whom he had been living with the past few weeks, and headed to his father's ranch. As he had done with everyone else he felt close to, when he arrived at 1:30 p.m. he hugged his dad and told him he loved him, borrowed the .44 caliber Magnum handgun he had given his father for Christmas in 1991 and borrowed his father's Jeep, telling him that he needed to find a quiet spot to do some thinking. About 45 minutes later, his father, who in his own fantasy life was the legendary Fritz Von Erich, got worried. Jack Atkinson had built a company largely to package and hype his alter ego as the greatest wrestler of all time and his children as the prodigal sons. He was the father of the ultimate fantasy family of athletes, but in reality he had already lost 4 of his 6 sons, none of whom saw their 26th birthday. He knew Carey had to pick up his 2 daughters, 9-year-old Holly and 6-year-old Lacey, from school. He searched on his ranch and found that the Jeep was empty. Then found the body partially hidden from the thicket. Apparently Carey had shot himself in the heart. The death marks the end of one of the most bizarre family stories any of us will ever know. The story is far beyond the significance of simply the pro wrestling world that the family was once among the most powerful and recognizable members of. The Von Erich dynasty, what at one time seemed to have been a brilliant marketing plan by Jack Atkinson dating back to the late 60s, saw the seeds bloom on Christmas night of 1982, and for the next 16 months he owned the hottest and most innovative wrestling company in the world. The cornerstones were his 3 young, athletic and at the time almost interchangeable sons. The youngest of the 3, Carey, was rivaled by only Hulk Hogan in Minneapolis and Jimmy Snuka in New York as the most popular wrestler in the country. Certainly in terms of attracting new fans and a young audience, the modern-day Warrior stood as almost a sure bet to become the biggest wrestling star in the world before too many more years were finished. While other promotions quickly caught up and surpassed Jack Atkinson's company, the marketing plan was still intact for a successful regional business. The Von Erichs were still the kings of North Texas. The first WrestleMania, which rocked the nation, died in Dallas. The Saturday night main events of the WWF, at the time a ratings success story around the country, was destroyed head-to-head by Atkinson's local television show on KTVT. The life didn't immediately get squeezed away from the territory, but instead lives themselves started ending one after another, a body count that engulfed the wrestling world with morbid fascination. The dynasty pretty well ended in April of 1987, with the death of Jack's fifth son, Michael, and third to die, at the age of 23, a suicide caused by overdosing on Placidil. Michael had been involved with frequent scrapes with the law during the last year of his life, and his death had been eerily predicted just 2 weeks before it happened by Jack's booker, Frank Bruiser Brody Goodish. Goodish was the only wrestler in the Glory era who rivaled the son's popularity in Texas, and in a bizarre turn of fate, he would be murdered just over 1 year later in a Puerto Rican dressing room. Less than 1 month after Mike's death, the 4th annual David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions took place at Texas Stadium. Only it was changed to the David and Mike Von Erich Memorial Show. Even the Dallas fans, who had a national reputation for being the most blindly loyal fans to the family of any fans in the world, suddenly woke up. 3 years earlier, when David's death was memorialized at Texas Stadium and drew what was at the time the second largest gate in pro wrestling history, 32,123 fans live, paying $402,000, trailing only the Bruno Sammartino vs. Larry Zbyszko 1980 match at Shea Stadium. Many of Jack's former closest friends and fellow compadres in the admittedly seedy business were repulsed at the attempt to make money capitalizing on his son's death. "When I was down there, late 70s, I thought Jack was as great a man as I'd ever known," said Denver sportscaster Steve Harms, who worked for a Dallas television station at the time and eventually became a referee, play-by-play announcer, and close personal friend of Jack Atkinson while his sons were first breaking in. "I was really disillusioned when they had the memorial after David died. After that I mainly followed them in The Observer. They lost touch with reality. The marks who would go to the shows twice a week got fed up when he faked the heart attack and with all the memorial shows. When I'd go down there on vacation and talk to the fans, that's what I kept hearing." But the Dallas area fans themselves largely didn't notice the exploitation at the first David Von Erich Memorial Bash on May 6, 1984. Even with the family photos and David memorabilia being sold at inflated prices, including a rushed-out 45 record called Heaven Needed a Champion being sung at the show and sold at the dozens of merchandise tables, a record cut by one of Jack's gospel-singing friends and released literally days after David's death, exploitation was not on most wrestling fans' mind. After all, in their own world of fantasy, their long-awaited dream that had been teased for about 2 years for most, and for nearly 2 decades for the older fans that followed Fritz's career, of Von Erich finally winning the NWA World Heavyweight title, was about to take place. Just a few miles down the road, the NBA Mavericks were in a do-or-die playoff game with the legendary Lakers of Kareem and Magic fame in a game that shocked the local sports community because it didn't sell out. Even during its heyday, the local community didn't understand the emotion and impact of so many that the world title in the Von Erichs meant, as more than twice as many fans attended the wrestling show. Kerry, who had teased fans for more than 4 years with his incredible near misses in world title matches against both Harley Race and Ric Flair, had promised his fans he'd win the title in memory of his recently deceased brother. While Flair and Kerry rushed through a 13-minute match which was nowhere near the level the two usually had, it ended up as probably the most famous match either would ever be involved in. Kerry won the belt and was mobbed by the Texas babyface wrestlers and received one of the most emotional pops in history. At the age of 24, he was the second youngest man ever to hold the World Heavyweight Wrestling title, with Thez in 1937, at the age of 21, being the youngest. As tears filled the eyes of the fans while Kerry walked down the aisle, Jack, who wrestled his final match ever that afternoon as the legendary Fritz Von Erich, and Doris met him halfway. Wrestling has never duplicated a scene like that, and may never again. For that one moment, Jack's fantasy world had taken such a hold that it actually became not only his family's and his loyal audience's reality, but reality for much of North Texas. Little did any of the 32,123 fans, wrestlers, Kerry or Jack himself realize that single moment, at which point they were on top of the world and their future under the 100-degree Texas sun seemingly would burn bright forever as the premier family and promotion in the world, that this was actually the beginning of the end. As the other end of the business deal that resulted in that crowning moment of his wrestling career, Kerry dropped the title back to Flair on May 24 in Yokosuka, Japan. Facing the reality that the moment when Kerry, Jack and Doris embraced before 32,123 cheering and teary-eyed fans was their apex came in the same spot, some 3 years later. Jack's World Class Championship Wrestling was overtaken by the Titan Sports and Jim Crockett Promotions. The compassion from the community at large when Mike nearly died from toxic shock syndrome over Labor Day weekend of 1985 turned into the general public's realization that something very serious was wrong when he was rushed into a heavily hyped public appearance several weeks later at the Cotton Bowl to wave and thank the fans during a major outdoor spectacular that drew 25,000 fans. The main event was a double hair versus hair match in which Kevin and Kerry beat Gino Hernandez and Chris Adams. As Gino tried to escape from his haircut, the youngest brother Chris, then 15, but only about 5'3", participated in his first major angle to set the stage for his future stardom by tackling Gino at ringside. Gino was dragged back into the ring and shaved bald. Barely 3 months later, Gino Hernandez, 28, the company's top heel, was dead of a cocaine overdose. Kerry's crippling injuries in the motorcycle accident preceded Mike's suicide, which made the tragedies into something only the densest marks couldn't see had turned into a pattern. While the loyal live and die with the Von Erichs fans remained, their numbers dwindled. The thousands of Texas teenagers who flocked to Reunion Arena for the first time in 1982 and nearly rioted when Kerry was screwed out of the title, and cried their eyes out when the newspapers, unaware of the phenomenon, devoted just a few short paragraphs buried in the back of the sports section to the death of David, which only became a front-page story in the local media on the second day after his death, after the local media realized just how much of an affect a Von Erich death had on the community, largely gave up in the wake of the death of Mike. Only 5,900 fans came to Texas Stadium on May 3, 1987, to see the David and Mike Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions. 8 days later, Kevin passed out and nearly died in a Fort Worth ring, only to be saved by CPR from wrestler Tommy Rogers. Another angle was created. His opponent when he collapsed, Brian Adias, who ironically was Kerry's real best friend from childhood but had recently turned heel, had developed a deadly Oriental tool punch that nearly killed his former best friend's older brother. About the time Mike first took ill, and with Kevin floating in and out of the business due to injuries and lack of interest, a phony Von Erich was created, the model like Lance Von Erich, real name Kevin William Vaughn. Lance was said to have been the cousin of the boys and the son of Waldo Von Erich, a one-time big-name wrestler himself who was the fictitious brother of Fritz Von Erich. Lance ironically suffered from the Von Erich curse as soon as he adopted the name, with a series of strange illnesses, traced largely to his heavy use of steroids, interfering with his own wrestling career. After a dispute with his uncle, Lance quit to work for an opposition group in Dallas, at which time a bitter and bombastic Fritz Von Erich, against all good judgment, went on the television show and said that Lance wasn't related to the family, that his real name was William Vaughn, and that he used the family in order to get a break in wrestling. Unbeknownst to Fritz, that outburst ended the family's credibility even more except to the dwindling Never Say Die fans, some of whom still remained as late as this past week. Kevin Vaughn then fell in love while on a wrestling tour of South Africa, and has lived there ever since. On Christmas night of that year, with the territory in shambles, the booker during the company's glory days, Ken Lusk, known in wrestling as Ken Mantell, bought into the territory. The idea to turn things around was on Christmas night, several heels would attack Fritz Von Erich and beat him nearly to death. Fritz faked that he had suffered a heart attack and was rushed off to emergency. While Dallas fans celebrated their holiday season, on the wrestling broadcast they were told of yet another impending Von Erich tragedy, only in this case, not only were the causes lied about, but the entire story was a work. On television the next few days, the announcers told how Fritz is touch and go and may not make it through the night. Even local television stations and newspapers fell for the act at the beginning, but Jack's magic with the local media was such that the truth never came out publicly, just like the truth about David's death was still the worked version in all media reports this past week. Outside of wrestling, he was never criticized for the stunt. Later the media and the promotion amended the story to have been a blow from a cane-caused temporary paralysis which was originally thought to have been a heart attack. Even Jack's closest friends in the wrestling business, none of whom were saints and all of whom specialized in stretching the truth and creating their own fantasy worlds for a buck, had long turned against this level of exploitation. It was too much to use the family's many tragedies that had moved the fans and attempting to create another near death as a means to get the territory off its back. Crowds did pick up as Kevin and Kerry sought to gain revenge on the perpetrators. That was the last time Fritz Von Erich set foot in world-class wrestling rings. He worked in Kerry's corner once in 1991 on a WWF show, but that was long after the family's magical image was gone. The death of the Von Erich legacy, which occurred more than 5 years before its brightest star took his own life, was also the death of North Texas wrestling. I don't think there will ever be anything big here as far as the wrestling business is concerned, said Sims. WWF and WCW can draw elsewhere, but when they come here, they can't draw. The people here are saying it's a screwed up world you're in, and we know about it. The story of the Von Erichs really started in 1949. Jack Atkinson was a backup offensive guard at Southern Methodist University and set a school record in the discus. But he lost his scholarship by violating team rules and getting married to the future Doris Atkinson. The two took off for Canada, where he played Canadian football with several future wrestling superstars including Gene Kinniski and Wilbur Snyder. In 1954, he learned wrestling from Stu Hart in Calgary, and he, Doris, and son Jackie Jr. lived in a trailer park on the Hart property. A few years later, he created the persona of Nazi heel Fritz von Erich, and with his large hands, he became the master of the deadly Iron Claw, when post-World War II Nazi and Japanese heels were the rage. While Nazi heels came and went, a 6'3", 275-pound powerhouse with agility, charisma, and a certain demonic sneer that exuded toughness and danger, became one of the country's biggest drawing cards. While working out of Buffalo in 1959, son Jackie, then 6, touched a live wire while he was outside during a storm, was given a major jolt and was knocked unconscious. He fell into a puddle and drowned to death. Personal tragedies aside, Fritz von Erich became a worldwide superstar in the 1960s. He held the AWA World title for a short period of time. He and Kerry remain to this day the only fathers in combination to each have held a major world heavyweight title, although in the NWA's lighter weight divisions the Guerrero and Dantes family also accomplished the same thing. One of the most famous faux pas ever in Japan was during a brutal main event match where Fritz was wrestling Giant Baba for the international title, which Fritz is one of the few men in history to hold. Baba went to blade himself to sell the Iron Claw, but instead of getting his forehead, he cut up Fritz's finger. Fritz's finger bled like crazy, and the Japanese press created what is now a famous story of Fritz suffering from a hangnail during this now legendary match. Due to real estate investments during a few Dallas-Fort Worth area building booms, he also became a millionaire. In the 1960s, he became a phenomenal drawing card in Texas for promoters Ed McLemore and Morris Siegel. In 1967, he pulled his big power play. Atkinson rallied all the North Texas wrestlers and pulled out the rug from under McLemore to start his own company. After winning a bitter promotional war, largely through the help of NWA President Sam Mushnick, who sided with his good friend and top draw, Atkinson hired McLemore and, learning from Mushnick that it's best to make peace with your former enemies, kept McLemore's name out front as the supposed promoter. Siegel, who sided with McLemore, passed away of a heart attack shortly thereafter. Fritz von Erich largely stopped touring at that point, mainly confining his ring activities to his own company, in which he quickly became, surprise, surprise, the top babyface. His promotion did consistently strong business by the early 70s, matching Fritz against whatever heel he could make money with, from a Johnny Valentine to a Mongolian stomper to a Professor Boris Malenko, and eventually running them out of town. The annual climactic world title matches against Kinniski and later Dory Funk Jr., which he'd come within a hair of winning, before either being screwed or going to the time limit, were moved outdoors to Texas Stadium because no indoor arena in the market could hold the crowd. A 1973 match with Funk, a 60-minute draw in 100-degree heat, set the state attendance and gate record with 26,339 fans paying $96,000. The attendance record stood until Kerry won the title in honor of brother David 11 years later. The gate record was first broken in Flair and Kerry's famous Christmas 1982 match. A rematch 1 year later drew 23,000 fans. At the same time, he was channeling his sons into sports and himself and his family into religion. Official Von Erich mythology has it that Jack was deeply moved by a sermon in 1974, and shortly thereafter a divine voice guided him to open his Bible to Psalms 23. Not long after that, the same powerful force somehow made him pull his car over to the shoulder of a highway one day and ponder his sin, beginning the Von Erichs' famous link with religion. A former friend of Jack's, and his many detractors who believed him to be less than sincere in his constant religious talk, will tell the story somewhat differently. Doris, who was deeply religious, had or was about to throw Jack out. Jack, who by this time had already began to conceptualize the company being built around his all-American family image, to save his family and his dream, became born again. Just as the first media story, in Penthouse magazine, which looked underneath the largely worked mythology that the local media had never examined, was about to be released, Ken Lusk, Jack's then partner in the office, said to the Dallas Times-Herald that anyone who says the Von Erichs aren't a Christian family, well, that's a crock. An outright lie. Being a Christian doesn't mean you are perfect, doesn't mean you haven't made mistakes in your life. There's another book that says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Perhaps since many influential in Texas traditionally protect their own, and nobody was more Texan than the Von Erichs, the sons of the ex-Nazi heel, even with 5 sons now dead. The local media has never examined this strange phenomenon as anything more than a series of tragic random coincidences to a family that somehow was jinxed. The truth is that these tragedies were patterned, frequent and predictable, with some obvious and other not so obvious root causes. Ironically, when the kid's one-time running mate in drugs and wrestling main events, Hernandez, passed away, his life story of drugs, and more drugs, was an open book in the local media, worthy of an award-winning newspaper story. When it came to the sons of Jack Atkinson, different rules seemed to prevail. About the same time his kids were the high school studs at Small Lake Dallas High, Jack Atkinson was named the new NWA president, replacing Mushnick, who decided to step down from power since he was in his late 60s. People remember Jack bringing Kevin, David, and Kerry, whose ages ranged from 18 to 15 at the time, to the NWA conventions in Las Vegas, in which the various NWA promoters would alternately kiss ass and backstab their compadres, and telling the other NWA promoters, almost arrogantly, how his kids would all be future NWA world champions. At the time, Kerry, then in 10th grade, was rumored to already be heavily into steroids. Whether it was simply parental obsession to create a string of super athletes, or he, and perhaps his brothers as well, fell into the steroids on their own, the 3 oldest were bona fide high school sports stars, facts that Jack made sure were constantly mentioned on his television shows, in his programs, in programs of other influential NWA promoters, and in wrestling magazines. David, named for Doris Atkinson's brother that passed away as a teenager from brain cancer, was 6'6", but thin as a rail when he entered the ring first, in the summer of 1977. He had received a basketball scholarship to North Texas State University in nearby Denton, but redshirted as a freshman and quit school after 1 year to work for his father. Kevin, 6'2" with a somewhat slight build, but with tremendous muscularity, followed a few months later. He was the starting fullback at North Texas State as a freshman, and had legitimate potential, but a series of concussions and knee injuries caused him to quit school and join brother David in the ring. Kerry, who was already taking on the dimensions of a bodybuilder in 10th grade, was a high school football star and, like his father, threw the discus. Kerry was both state and junior national champion as a senior in high school, setting a small high school state record that stood for more than a decade. He received a football and track scholarship to the University of Houston. But, like his brothers, he only lasted 1 year in college before pro wrestling came calling. He redshirted in football, but starred in track, including winning at the discus in the Texas Relays. All 3 brothers had become national superstars through Atkinson's company, renamed World Class Championship Wrestling, getting national syndication in 1981 and 1982 through a state-of-the-art television production from the Dallas Sportatorium. The first Slick Wrestling program preceded TBS and WWF in fast-paced, slickly edited productions complete with hard rock entrance music, which attracted a largely teenage audience, with a heavy percentage of girls, to see Jack's 3 heartthrob sons. By the time Michael made his pro debut on November 18, 1983, the promotion was the hottest in the land, and his brothers were all local mega-celebrities and national wrestling superstars. The Von Erichs, along with Hogan, Flair and the Road Warriors, dominated the covers and the coverage in all the national wrestling magazines during that time period. Behind the scenes, within wrestling, the outside-the-ring bizarre stories of the Von Erichs, largely based around drug problems, were legion. I remember going with Gary, Hart, Kerry, Kevin, Gino, and David on road trips, recalled Harms. We'd go to the hotel. David, Kerry, and Gino would load up on Quaaludes and Placidos. They had a doctor who provided them with anything they wanted and as much as they wanted. I remember once being in Fritz's office when Gino called and needed 400 Quaaludes, and he got them that afternoon. Within wrestling, it was generally believed the father was in denial about his son's drug problems. Stories are legion that his lieutenants in the company would beg the father to open his eyes, but he would never believe his sons would do such things. Even during the glory years of 1983 and 1984, Kevin, David, and Kerry, who were in huge demand as local celebrities for public appearances, developed bad reputations among local merchants for either showing up incoherent or not showing up at all. The company was making big money running 2-spot shows per night in area high schools, usually using local non-profit organizations as sponsors, which at one point consistently drew consistently large and phenomenally enthusiastic crowds to see the Von Erichs in the flesh. The idolatry was so out of control that banners like, "On the 8th day, God created the Von Erichs," at matches, were not the exception. Unfortunately, that business started falling off as the sons frequently no-showed the cards and the sponsors, feeling burned, lost interest in world-class wrestling. Whenever anything came up about Kevin and Kerry from the Lake Dallas Police Department, Fritz always said it was the police's fault, Harms recalled. Once Kevin drove his car into a lake. The next day, he had a new car and it was like nothing had happened. But they were the model children around their dad's friends. They were the most polite and friendly kids you can imagine. In June of 1983, Kerry was arrested at DFW Airport coming back from his honeymoon with Kathy in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Customs agents found him with 18 unmarked tablets in his right front pocket. He was hiding nearly 300 assorted downers like Percodan and codeine pills in a plastic bag in the crotch of his pants, had 10 grams of marijuana and 6.5 grams of an undetermined blue and white powder. The incident made the newspapers, with Kerry going on television begging fans not to believe what you read in the newspapers. The most hardcore Von Erich marks dismissed the story, believing Kerry's insidious enemy, Freebird Michael Hayes, must have planted the drugs on him. Not so surprisingly, the evidence somehow disappeared from the police station and all charges were dropped. Atkinson's territory was only a moderate small-time promotion in the North Texas area, built around himself and his 3 soon-to-be famous sons in the early 80s. When, at age 53, he decided to hold his big retirement show at Texas Stadium in the spring of 1982, just 6,000 fans attended. 4 months later at Reunion Arena came the first major sign that the seeds of his family marketing concept were going to pay big dividends when more than 10,000 fans came to see Kerry's 2 out of 3 fall double disqualification with Flair, after which Fritz labeled Kerry as the uncrowned world champion. Unlike at Texas Stadium a few months earlier, which drew a traditional wrestling crowd, this crowd was filled with high schoolers and younger. The younger kids, most of whom had never attended a live wrestling show before, clicked in by relating to Kerry, at the time just 22, in his chance to win the World Heavyweight title for Texas. A rematch was scheduled for a few months later, but Kerry's knee went out and he needed minor surgery at the time Flair was booked into Fort Worth. Older brother David took his place and vowed to win the title for Texas. When Flair attacked the still-on-crutches Kerry and began stomping on his recently operated knee, causing a near riot among the new fans who discovered this pseudo-sport, David lost his cool and got disqualified. On Christmas night, Jack Atkinson's slot machine came up cherries to the tune of state record gross of $105,000 for the Flair vs. Kerry cage match for the NWA title. The legendary match ended when Terry Gordy slammed the cage door on Kerry's head, a finish imitated many times over the next decade but never with the same results. The resulting Freebirds vs. Von Erich's marriage became one of the hottest feuds in pro wrestling history. It also made World Class the first American promotion that captured the quality and set the standard for the wrestling of the future. From that point forward, the Friday night cards at the Sportatorium became weekly sellouts. Spot show business picked up even more with the young roguish Freebirds as the natural foes. The 3 shows at Reunion Arena the next year all sold out at near $200,000, setting a state gate record each time out of the box, with several thousands turned away at each show. On Thanksgiving night, the loser leave town match with Kerry vs. Hayes not only sold out a few days in advance but thousands of those turned away stayed out in the 0-degree weather outside the arena watching through the glass to watch the television monitors to see what was going on inside. Because of the success, Atkinson's power increased within the alliance and his dream of having a son as world champion started being closer to reality. Of course, Atkinson wasn't going to be satisfied with that, as he wanted, at one point, every one of his sons to get the belt. It appeared David, who wasn't as good an all-around athlete as Kevin or Kerry, but was the smartest, the most reliable, and the best worker, would be the first to get the chance. Apparently David, the one pushed as being the most like Fritz, was promised the title in 1983 from Harley Race, but through maneuverings of Jim Crockett, Flair got the title for a second time that Thanksgiving night at the First Starrcade. The Flair-David match on Christmas night of 1983 was again sold out well in advance, despite a week-long ice storm. The predictable over-the-top rope DQ saved the title finish climax the company's most profitable year ever. The same week Flair got the title back that David was destined for, Michael made his pro debut. Immediately, a match was set up between Flair and Michael for Fort Worth in January 1984. It was a 10-minute match, and if Flair won, David would never get a return match. If Mike won, or lasted 10 minutes, David would get a title match and he could pick the time, place and all stipulations. David went one step farther, saying if he couldn't beat Flair this time, he'd retire from wrestling. Mike, at 19 years old and all of 180 pounds, not only lasted the 10 minutes, but had Flair out with a sleeper when the bell expired in what had to be one of the most forgettable and regrettable matches of the latter's career. 1 week later David, who had won the United National title, one of 3 All Japan singles belts later unified into the current Triple Crown title, and was apparently set to dump the belt to Genichiro Tenryu, thereby setting Tenryu up as a #1 contender when David eventually returned as world champion, left for All Japan Pro Wrestling. David went to Ribera Steakhouse in Tokyo, a hangout for wrestlers, on his first night in Japan with Bell and the late Scott Irwin, who were working as the Super Destroyers at the time. He was drinking heavily. On February 10th, he wasn't in the lobby for the bus taking them to the arena on the opening night of the tour. Ref Joe Higuchi along with Bruiser Brody and Jerry Morrow broke into his hotel room and found him dead on the floor. He was 25. Brody immediately flushed the drugs down the toilet. It was reported in Penthouse that the drugs were Placidals, the same drug his brother Michael would eventually overdose on as well. The mythology machine went to work immediately. To this day, the official press reports that were still used in all newspaper stories about Kerry's death reported the death from an inflamed intestine, technically known as enteritis. The enteritis story originally was released as occurring from a hard kick in a match in Japan, which was definitely a lie since David died the night before his first match of the tour. Over the ensuing years, the Von Erichs in different press interviews have changed the story many times about David's death, including calling it a stroke, a heart attack after a strenuous match in Japan, food poisoning from sushi, and an injury suffered and ignored by David just before leaving for Japan in a match he and Kevin had against the Road Warriors in San Antonio. There was nothing even close to true about any of the above stories, since he of course hadn't had his first match on the tour. Ribera's doesn't serve sushi, and he and Kevin had never wrestled the Road Warriors. David's funeral, open to the public, drew 3,500 wrestling fans, the largest funeral procession in North Texas in many years. Within days, Heaven Needed a Champion was released and Texas Stadium was booked for one of the biggest wrestling spectaculars ever. David was the one Jack, saw as taking over the business. Harms remembered. He wanted David to become the NWA champion so he could have some time making big money. David wasn't in love with being in the ring. His love was horses. He saw wrestling as a way to set himself up for a great life. Kevin and Kerry were always their own biggest marks. David was a more stable guy. At about this time, Kevin started becoming a different wrestler. The most gifted athletically of the entire family, the barefooted Kevin specialized in flying moves which would be considered normal fare by the top wrestlers today, but by the standards of the time were spectacular. His dropkicks rivaled Jim Brunzel's as the best in the business. Most wrestlers, however, didn't like working with him because he worked stiff, didn't like to sell much despite being around 225 pounds, and injured people. Many observers from that time believe that when Kerry was given the title shot at Texas Stadium that was originally scheduled for David, it was the first sign that the three-way parity that the brothers were always pushed as having was out the window, and a public sign from either the promotion or the alliance itself that Kerry was a bigger star than Kevin. Kevin at least appeared genuinely despondent that he wasn't the one who was going to get to win the title in his brother's name since he was the older brother. Even if it was all simply a work, he was never the same wrestler after that point. Kerry became the superstar of the family and Kevin slowly faded in and out of wrestling over the next few years with less and less notice each time. The tragedies and the public nature of them seemingly got to him more and more as the years went by. He used to tell people that when you're a regular person, you have skeletons in your closet. When you're a Von Erich, you have them dangling in your front yard. While Jack may have deluded himself that his sons could do no wrong, apparently the sons in many cases believed they couldn't do enough right. Growing up and having to then live with the Von Erich name, they apparently believed they had to live up to a standard of athletic and moral perfection that few could attain. Those within the Texas wrestling scene have always pointed at Fritz as the villain in the family story. The usually jovial Boyd Pierce, who worked for years in Dallas as a television and ring announcer and is well known in wrestling for not having anything bad to say about almost anyone, used to joke that Will Rogers never met Fritz Von Erich, in reference to Will Rogers saying that he never met a man he didn't like. Certainly the combination of the permissiveness in the upbringing, protection from having to deal with their mistakes, combined with the destiny of their future drummed into them from childhood that they couldn't live up to, made them ill-equipped for coping with the real world. They were taught that David and Jackie were in a better place, and it was no work that the brothers were all close with one another and, one by one, maybe it became time to join them. No matter what the real background reasons were, this was one screwed-up family. Even before the deaths, that was the general consensus within wrestling. But even his fiercest critics and enemies have to admit that for whatever deceptions and abuses he propagated throughout the years, and there were many, that he has paid for them in personal grief many times over. Still, the talk of Fritz Von Erich, the villain of the Von Erich story, largely came after the death of Michael. Unlike his brothers, Mike was not a good athlete. It only meant the Von Erich mythology would have to be more creative. Mike was billed as having been the best amateur wrestler and best all-around athlete of the brothers. He was said to have broken Kevin's record for the most points in the high school district track meet, which Kevin probably didn't set in the first place. None of this was true, as Mike never competed in track beyond the junior varsity level and played special teams on his small high school football team. He was said to have the potential to surpass all the others. Mike, who was 6'1", but resembled David greatly, was thrust into the spotlight faster than ever because there needed to be 3 Von Erichs on top, and David was gone. When the announcers would fawn all the praise on Mike about being a better athlete than his brothers, he would stand there embarrassed about the praise and nervous on his interviews. From all accounts, Mike never wanted to be a wrestler. Soon he was pushed as a main eventer, a world title contender, held the group's American title, beat all the top heels and virtually never did any jobs, all at around 190 pounds and is one of the poorest main event performers of the era. Even at that, on July 4, 1984 in Fort Worth, Mike participated in the match of the year, a 6-man tag, against the Freebirds. The Penthouse article stated the pressure led Mike not only to dangerous doses of steroids to increase his size, but to uppers and downers as well. He was forever separating a chronic bad shoulder, suffered in a high school sports injury when he tumbled over hurdles. The trouble started piling up. In May 1985, he was charged with 2 counts of misdemeanor assault against an emergency room physician. A Denton County jury acquitted him. In September he contracted the toxic shock syndrome that nearly killed him. The greatest crime came in July, when he was, amidst incredible hype, put back into the ring. The return of Mike to Reunion Arena drew 10,000 fans. In November, he totaled his Lincoln Continental when he ran off an embankment but escaped with only a minor head injury. Kevin went on television the next week discussing the incident and blamed himself, saying he kept Mike up too late that night studying wrestling videotapes. He was later arrested and spent 5 hours in jail on drunk and disorderly charges. A few months later, criminal mischief charges were dismissed against him when he agreed to pay a Fort Worth man $900 for kicking in the door of his car. On April 11, 1987, Mike left a bar in Denton and was swerving severely while driving home. An officer pulled him over and found a small bottle of marijuana, 2 bottles incorrectly labeled that actually contained 78 pills of 5 varieties, mainly painkillers. Mike tried to bribe the cop, but when that failed, agreed to a blood test. While it showed his alcohol level at a legal .05, it also showed several drugs, presumably placidols, barbiturates and Valium or its equivalents, in his system. He was arrested for drunk driving and controlled substance charges. When he was released, it was the last time he was seen alive. While a suicide note was found before his body, the promotion announced at a spot show in Lubbock after Mike had disappeared but before his body was found, that he was missing and foul play was suspected. The attempt, which didn't succeed this time, was to work the story once again. The cause of death was an overdose of Placidil, self-administered. Chris Atkinson had been around wrestling dressing rooms for as long as anyone could remember. While growing up, it was considered a given that one day he'd be a superstar wrestler. But unlike even Mike, who at least played some sports in high school, Chris's asthma kept him away from athletics. He always pulled around with older brother Mike and wore his hair and dressed like Kerry. Chris was even smaller than Mike, at about 5'5", 165. On a religious television show about the Von Erichs in early 1986, Fritz was on bragging about Chris was the best amateur wrestler of the group, and had only lost once as an amateur, to a boy 7 years older than him. The host, who had heard Fritz going on and on about the sports accomplishments of Kevin, Kerry, and Mike, by this time was even incredulous, and when Fritz started his spiel about little Chris, sarcastically said, "And he never lost an amateur wrestling match." By the time Chris got out of high school, Kevin and Kerry had nearly put the company out of business, and Jerry Jarrett took over as a partner and was in control of the office, and didn't want to use Chris, who had done some independent work. It ended in a messy split when Jarrett tried to push his son Jeff and phase down Kevin and Kerry, and eventually both the Von Erichs and Jarrett wound up out of the market with Global in control. Just before the Von Erich/Jarrett split up, Jarrett finally relented and booked Chris in a few gimmick matches, mainly against Percy Pringle. Sims trained Chris, surprisingly, had virtually never been in the ring until a few weeks before his debut and his matches with Pringle, now the WWF's Paul Bearer. He had a suicidal mind, Sims remembered about Chris. Chris was hampered by his asthma, and his medication caused him to lose muscle tone. The police believe the combination of an arm injury suffered a few weeks before his death and the medication caused him to become despondent of him losing his physique, and he was having a difficult time coming to grips with the fact he wasn't going to be able to make it as a wrestler. On September 12, 1991, Chris called up Kevin and was very despondent. At 9 p.m. Kevin and Doris found Chris about 150 yards from the family ranch. He had shot himself in the head with a 9mm pistol. He was rushed to East Texas Medical Center in Tyler, where he passed away at 10:27 p.m. Investigators found a one-page handwritten suicide note, where Chris wrote that his family was not to blame for his suicide and that he was sorry. In the note, he wrote about his 3 older brothers who had died, but there was no indication that played a part in his decision to take his own life. He was 21. I remember right after Chris shot himself that Carrie and I went to eat with his 2 daughters, recalled Sims. We started talking about Chris and he said Chris had a lot of balls. I asked, why do you say that? He said, it took a lot of balls to put a gun to your head. Bruce Hart, at least in some ways, grew up in a similar environment as the Von Erichs. His father was a legendary wrestler and became a promoter. His brothers all wrestled at one time or another. Like Carrie, one of his brothers eventually became world champion. He even had a tragic death, Brother Dean at age 36, although it was not drug-related or self-inflicted, and some other brothers who had their own problems, some of which went public. I can relate to the pressure, said Hart. Maybe the difference is we were able to see it was a work. I remember talking with Kevin and Carrie and we talked about our similarities and it's pretty weird. My biggest perception of the difference was the drugs, but it's a cause and effect thing. Most of us were pretty clean, which enabled us to deal with our problems less traumatically. Our father also never allowed us to deify ourselves. Fritz was relentless in pushing them. They weren't bad kids. I saw them as being pretty sensitive. Carrie always seemed to be reaching out for a lifeline. As a performer, Carrie was somewhat green, but carryable, but loaded with a certain dumb jock charisma that appealed to teenage girls that no promotion has been able to duplicate since. At the same time, he wasn't pretty enough to alienate the guys when he started clicking as a draw in 1982. He worked with the best and learned from the best over the next 2 years until the time that he became one of the best himself. By early 1985, he and Ric Flair toured several territories: Hawaii, Missouri, Mid-South, and of course his home world-class area, and put on the state-of-the-art matches for that time period. The world-class television and the Von Erich name was so strong that Flair and Carrie were able to sell out Honolulu for their 60-minute draw, sell out St. Louis for a 65-minute draw, and draw a $175,000 house at the Superdome in New Orleans, all out of Carrie's home territory, in the first few months of 1985. Most were classics, but not all. One night Flair and Carrie had to work a 60-minute draw in Fort Worth, and nobody could find Carrie. Eventually they found him passed out in his car. They managed to revive him and get him into the ring, but he was zombie-like and Flair had to carry him through perhaps the worst 60-minute draw of his career. Carrie was brought into Chicago for an AWA card at Comiskey Park that drew more than 20,000 and got a bigger pop than any of the regulars. Every promoter in wrestling wanted to be a part of the Carrie Von Erich gravy train. Still, in early 1986, unexplainably, his performance started wavering. In June 1986, Carrie was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. He was traveling at an unsafe speed riding his bike wearing nothing but gym shorts and no shoes. He made an ill-advised pass and crashed into the back of a patrol car. After 13 hours of a new process called microsurgery, they transplanted muscle and skin tissue from Carrie's back to restore circulation and try to save his foot. He also suffered a dislocated hip, a crushed right ankle and many internal injuries. Nearly every specialist put to rest any hopes of him ever coming back to the ring. The promotion, at this time on a noticeable downslide and feeling the pressure from the expansion of the WWF, Mid-South and Crockett all coming into North Texas, put the big lie back into effect. The Von Erich mythology, as given by Kevin on television, was that Carrie was in a motorcycle accident, as everyone had already heard. But it wasn't serious, and he'd be back in the ring in about a month. When that month was up, Kevin would say Carrie would be back in about another month or two. The fear was that if fans were told it would be a year, or maybe never, before Carrie could return, they'd tune out of world class and either forget wrestling, or turn to the opposition groups which had their own stable of superstars. By Thanksgiving, Carrie showed up on television on crutches and took about 2 baby steps on his own. It seemed well past insanity 1 month later when it was announced Carrie would return to the ring on a major show in Fort Worth against his former best friend Brian Adias. On crutches, Carrie came into the building, then, according to Penthouse, a doctor filled a syringe with enough Novocaine to numb Secretariat, and Carrie walked to the ring, and basically immobile, worked a 5-minute match, winning of course. But the news was mainly bad. The Von Erich magic was gone to the masses in Dallas. Kerry's return drew only 2,326 fans, and in the process, his ankle was rebroken. 4 months later, his foot was supposedly permanently fused into a walking position. Miraculously enough, Kerry returned to action on Thanksgiving of 1987 and toured Japan with Kevin a few weeks later. All things considered, the very fact he could still work, let alone work at an acceptable level, although he was never able to come anywhere close to his 1985 peak, may have been, in reality as opposed to fantasy, the thing he should be most admired for. In the fantasy world of his own promotion, Kerry became a world champion once again. Kerry had beaten Al Perez on March 6, 1988 in Dallas to win the world-class title, since the promotion by this time had split with Crockett, who controlled the NWA title. Kerry traded it once with Jerry Lawler and Tatsumi Fujinami during the year before the title was done away with after Lawler won a pay-per-view unification match in Chicago. Somewhere along the way, Kerry's bad foot was amputated. It's not clear whether the microsurgery, which was at best a 50-50 proposition in those days, failed to be successful, or if he did so much damage making his ill-advised comeback match with Adias and the operation that it was released as having diffused to foot was actually the amputation. Most likely it was the latter, since many in wrestling have said that Kerry being put into the ring with Adias well before he was ready played a part in his losing his foot. It was largely unknown in wrestling circles, although a few people working for the Dallas office had suspicion since Kerry never removed his boot, even while showering. One time some of the wrestlers told the story of going into a pool with Kerry, who went in with his boot on, and when he got out of the water, there was an incredible amount of water coming out of his boot. The world, or at least the inside wrestling world, first heard the story in the summer of 1988 when he was on an AWA show in Las Vegas against Colonel De Beers. De Beers grabbed Von Erich by the boot of his right foot, and suddenly, the boot came off, revealing a sock without a foot in it. De Beers and the fans at ringside who saw this were taken aback. A hush drew over the stunned crowd. Von Erich grabbed his boot, put his leg under the ring to hide it, and put the boot back on. When the word leaked about the incident, which initially was only reported in this and one other publication, denials came everywhere. Rob Rusin, who was doing publicity for the AWA, denied the story, despite the fact he was sitting right in front when it happened. Jerry Lawler, who was feuding with Von Erich at the time, claimed he had seen the foot, that it was all scarred up and that's why Von Erich never took the boot off. Because of the denials, this turned into one of the most controversial issues of late 1988. The WWF even got involved, as before the Lawler-Von Erich pay-per-view match, they went to the Illinois Commission and tried to get Von Erich banned from wrestling because of an ancient statute in the books about boxers and wrestlers with amputated limbs being unable to perform. The commission avoided the issue by scheduling a hearing for Von Erich after the match date, by which time everything was forgotten since there was no political advantage in blocking Von Erich from wrestling other than screwing with the show. The two had an excellent match, with Von Erich losing when the ref stopped the match because he was bleeding. Before the match even started, Kerry was fooling around with the blade backstage, and somehow sliced up his arm, which was bleeding as he came to the ring fourth match. A few weeks before the match, Von Erich told Bill Apter that he could photograph him with his boot off after the match to end the controversy. All night Von Erich continued to stall until finally he told Apter just to tell everyone that he saw him with his boot off and to tell people he had seen his right foot. In early 1990, WCW called up Kerry to bring him in, thinking they could bring back the Flair-Kerry feud and hoped that it still had its box office magic. However, Kerry no-showed his first scheduled TV appearance and WCW chalked him up as a lost cause. A few months later, WWF came calling and Kerry grabbed the chance to resurrect himself as a national star. Vince McMahon, who no doubt wanted Kerry as much as almost anyone when he started his national expansion in 1984, McMahon's own magazine occasionally reported on the Von Erichs while ignoring the existence of every other promotion, talked Kerry into leaving Texas. As irony would have it, at almost the same time, Brutus Beefcake suffered a parasailing accident and Kerry, now renamed the Texas Tornado, took his place against Mr. Perfect to capture the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam of 1990. The reign was short-lived, and Kerry slowly moved his way down the cards. In February of 1992, his father called the WWF and said his son was having drug problems and needed rehab. At the same time, Kerry was arrested for forging prescriptions. The much-publicized drug raid of the WWF dressing room in St. Louis was largely caused on a tip that was believed to have been related to Kerry, who no-showed the card since it was during the period Titan had given him off for rehab. Kerry finally went through the rehab, and apparently it made a difference over the short run. But by the summer, WWF let Kerry go. Kerry was a time bomb ready to explode, and the WWF was in no position to be able to not be seriously damaged by the explosion. "We did everything we could for him," said WWF spokesperson Steve Planamenta in August when the company released him. 4 hours after Kerry's death, Jack Atkinson had to come up with the final chapter of the Von Erich mythology. Jack admitted that his son had his right foot amputated, who said everyone at the hospital and the physical therapists had all been sworn to secrecy about. No one knew. "It was extremely painful at first," he said in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. "Kerry's had a drug problem since that accident, and no one was ever about to tell why." He said Kerry didn't want anyone to tell because fellas might think he was weaker. The story that nobody knew was another example of not accepting what was going on in the real world and accepting only self-created fantasy. Kerry's predicament was a major story in late 1988, and was even reported in one Dallas newspaper shortly after the incident with De Beers in Las Vegas. Still, the Dallas television media acted stunned at revelation. The story of his drug problem beginning with the accident is also not accurate. Gray Pearson, promoter of the Friday night shows at the Sportatorium, immediately went public hyping a Kerry Von Erich memorial show for the next evening. Kerry had been scheduled in the main event on the card against Dave Sheldon, who ironically uses the ring name Angel of Death. That afternoon, Kevin Atkinson, 35, the lone living son of Jack, who flew home the day before from a wrestling tour of the Virgin Islands, went to the Dallas media and decried the event. Kevin said that he, his father and his mother disapproved of the event, wouldn't be at the event, and accused Pearson of trying to capitalize on his brother's death. "I want the people to know that the Von Erichs don't have anything to do with that at all. In fact, I think it's terrible to try and exploit something like that." The irony of that statement was lost on very few. Many of the 3,038 fans, still heavily papered, but is expected it was the most paid at a Sportatorium wrestling event in a long time, particularly women, sobbed at ringside during the 45-minute ceremony. Sims Sheldon, Jack's longtime lieutenant in the glory days, David Manning, Chris Adams, Japanese photographer Jimmy Suzuki, and Dallas City Councilman Al Lipscomb all delivered eulogies in a ring decorated with flowers and plants with a huge photo of Kerry, with one of his wrestling robes and a pair of his boots on display. A shocking number of fans, the ones who, like Kerry, were unable to let go of the fantasy despite one news story after another over the past decade, still wouldn't allow themselves to face the truth. Many believed somebody shot him, and that the drug stories involving him were all concocted. The reality was that Kerry Atkinson was a likable guy according to those who knew him best, if you could get past the fact he was sheltered in almost a Peter Pan-like existence, where he didn't have to grow up. But you had to accept that about him. He wasn't particularly intelligent, but that was part of his charm to the fans and his friends, and he had a lot of both, and part of the funny stories that he'll leave behind. He was hardly a saint. Certainly he wasn't particularly honest, but some of that can be traced to his upbringing where he was taught to con the marks at all times and yet con himself into clinging to the fantasy. Not clinging to the fantasy of wrestling, but to the fantasy of the Von Erichs, to the same bitter end that, sad to say, was his destiny. Almost no different than Andre the Giant. He was a great athlete, and maybe under different circumstances would have been the biggest stars in this profession, a spot he was seemingly destined for a decade ago. But if he ever had reached that spot, the travel and the pressures of the spotlight probably would have self-destructed him in one form or another. The one thing, ironically, that as an athlete and as a competitor he deserves the most credit for, being able to come back to the ring with one foot and still perform better than many, no matter how ill-advised it probably was, had to be hidden because it, too, would have meant facing reality. Some of the bizarre things, like the night after his wife served him with divorce papers when he grabbed the house mic at the Sportatorium and told the fans that his wife was divorcing him so he'd be collecting phone numbers in the back, were probably less based on ego and arrogance as much as naivete and stupidity. Others, like when he would go to a spot show and say he would let fans take Polaroids with him for $5 and that all the money would go to charity, but somehow the money never went to charity, may have been as much based on his upbringing in regard to fans simply being marks to be conned. But it was those same fans that gave him his world. It was the only real world he knew. It was the world where he was Kerry Von Erich, the modern-day warrior. It was the only world he could survive in. And that world was coming to an end. Kerry Atkinson was buried alongside his brothers on February 22 at Grove Hill Memorial Park in East Dallas. Of the many major deaths in wrestling in recent years, none received the amount of media coverage as this one. Ironically, neither World Championship Wrestling, which ran a pay-per-view event on Sunday, nor the World Wrestling Federation, which ran its live Monday Night Raw show the following evening, acknowledge the death of the man who not all that many years ago was one of the 3 or 4 biggest stars in its world. Even under the most real of circumstances, they still had to ignore it on the grounds it might interfere with their fantasy. Maybe in that way, Kerry Von Erich did the only thing he had learned, protecting his fantasy world to the bitter end. March 8, 1993. The funeral for Atkinson, who committed suicide 4 days earlier than Andre the Giant's death, was held on February 22 at the First Baptist Church in Dallas before about 500 onlookers in a ceremony open to the public. Many Dallas area wrestlers attended, although the only out-of-towners that were there were Jim Helwig, Ultimate Warrior, and Bret and Owen Hart. Other wrestling personalities in attendance included Scott Putski, Terry Sims, Stephen Dane, Calvin Knapp, retired wrestler/referee Bronco Lubick, former referee/booker David Manning, Bob Beto, promoter in southeastern Texas, Tony Adams and Jimmy Papa, musician behind the WCW Slam Jam album. Pallbearers included Helwig, Bill Colville, longtime family bodyguard, and Kerry's ex-father-in-law. There were no speakers at the service. Helwig, who became friends with Kerry in 1986 when he wrestled for his father in the world-class promotion as Dingo Warrior, has talked about starting a trust fund for Kerry's 2 daughters, since Kerry left the family with no money. In addition, the Global Wrestling Federation will be presenting a benefit show on April 2 at the Dallas Sportatorium, with all proceeds going into a trust fund for Kerry's 2 daughters. Promoter Gray Pearson started the trust with a $1,000 donation, and Max Andrews, the former television syndicator for the Von Erichs' defunct World-Class Championship Wrestling promotion, added a $500 donation. Peace was made with Kerry's family as brother Kevin will work the main event and father Fritz will make his first appearance at a pro wrestling show in more than 2 years, and his first at the Sportatorium since he gave us his company 4 years ago to appear in Kevin's Corner. The promotion, Gray Pearson, 817-265-7771, is looking for any independent name wrestlers who would like to appear at the benefit and will help provide transportation to the event for out-of-towners. They are also going to try and get cooperation from both WWF and WCW, and hopefully both groups will supply talent for this benefit show. The normal free passes, which make up the large bulk of the Friday night Sportatorium audience each week, will be eliminated on this show, and ticket prices will be increased. On the tasteless end of all this, at this past Friday's show at the Sportatorium, Skander Akbar, who no doubt will wind up managing Kerry's opponent and be in the opposite corner from Fritz on the April 2 card, did a live interview saying that he had no sympathy for Kerry Von Erich, and he agreed with Judge Larry Baraka's statement about Kerry taking the coward's way out. Baraka, who was the judge scheduled to hear Kerry's case, was quoted in the Dallas Morning News the morning after the death as saying that Kerry took the coward's way out, which infuriated the hardcore wrestling marks in the area. Akbar then proclaimed himself the real king of Dallas wrestling, as opposed to Fritz. They can't let it go, can they? I guess it can be rationalized by saying Kerry would have wanted it that way, which is probably true. April 12, 1993. The other major show of the weekend was the Holly and Lacey Atkinson benefit card on April 2 at Dallas Sportatorium. The show drew 1,720, 1,570 paid, and raised approximately $15,000 to $16,000 for the children of Kerry Atkinson. Although the GWF has often drawn larger crowds in the Sportatorium, most of the tickets are giveaways, and it'll certainly be the largest paid crowd in the building in a few years. There were a lot of problems with the card, which was highlighted by the return of Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts to Dallas as the Freebirds. First, the Jim Helwig, Ultimate Warrior, situation. Helwig was well known as being one of Kerry's best friends both in Dallas when he achieved some fame as Dingo Warrior and in the WWF. Helwig was advertised for the show even though the promotion actually had never contacted him. The promotion claimed they called him several times and he never called back, which may very well have been true, except that they didn't even get his phone number until a week or so before the card, and they had been advertising him as appearing for several weeks before even making the call. Helwig was out of town. He lives in Arizona, in New York this past week, which was reported on the Pro Wrestling Spotlight radio show over the weekend as several days' worth of meetings with the Justice Department. So if he was called, he wasn't there to receive them. It was estimated that 1/3 of the crowd came specifically to see him, and no announcement was even made at any point about his not being there. I don't know that the situation was with Jake Roberts and the Fantastics, whose names were mentioned on TV promos, although neither were being advertised by the promotion in the final week. Sid Vicious had his first match in almost 1 year on the card, teaming with Guy billed as Johnny Rotten, who I believe was an old friend who taught him how to wrestle. Insert your own punchline here. The two ended up losing to the Ebony Experience, with Rotten naturally doing the favor. The main event was Kevin Von Erich and Chris Adams against Hayes and Roberts, managed by Skander Akbar. Hayes and Roberts got a huge face reaction coming down, actually much larger than Kevin, Adams and Fritz got, although once the match began they turned the crowd as heels. Finish saw Kevin put the claw on Roberts while Hayes was beating up Adams in the corner and Fritz had the claw on Akbar. Kevin pinned Roberts, who I'm told looked really good in the ring, which is saying something since it's been years since he's wrestled regularly, at which point Angel of Death did a run-in to save Adams from Hayes. The idea was to use the match to shoot the top angle for this group's future, with Akbar having a reason to place a bounty on Angel. There was at least some consternation in that all the wrestlers were working the show gratis as a benefit for Kerry's daughters, and while Kevin did thank the wrestlers, Fritz never did, and neither ever said anything on the house mic to the fans. This show was also taped for home video. April 19, 1993. The saga of the Von Erich wrestling family was covered in depth on April 11 and April 12 in a 5-page two-part series entitled The Von Erichs, An American Tragedy in the Sports section of the New York Daily News. The story, by hockey writer Barry Mizell, included numerous quotes from Jack, Fritz, his former wife Doris, Kevin and Kerry's ex-wife Kathy. The story did give what appeared to be some new insight into one of the most tragic and bizarre stories in the history of the wrestling profession, particularly in certain attitudes in the aftermath of the death of David in 1984. However, all quotes from Jack and Kevin, given the track record, have to be taken with more than the standard grain of salt. In other areas, the story was lacking, particularly in factual research regarding certain well-chronicled occurrences in the family's history. Perhaps the biggest negative to the story was all of the neon sign obvious messages that can be learned about confusing reality with fantasy and the problems of achieving too much fame, particularly fame stemming from such heavy manipulation too fast and the aftermath of when it's gone, were nowhere to be found. At times the story read like just the latest media chapter in the Von Erich mythology. Overall, the reporter did a good job of writing an interesting story while having little background on it going in, but there was so much missing that shouldn't have been hard to find. The Daily News story stated that Kerry had said over and over again that he would kill himself before he'd ever spend a day in jail. It also said that he had lunch just hours before committing suicide with his ex-wife that day and told her that he'd kill himself she wouldn't agree to get back together with him, although he had said that to her on numerous occasions previously in an effort to get her to take him back. I think people are getting awfully simplistic when they start looking for a reason, said Doris Atkinson, Kerry's mother, in what was probably her first newspaper interview since the death. You're talking about a lifetime of all current emotions. To say it's all so-and-so's fault is awfully simplistic. It's like saying it's all my fault because I married him. It's all my fault because I married him at 17 instead of waiting until he was 30. And maybe then it means it's all Fritz's mom's fault for having him, or all my mother's fault for having me in the first place. There are no real answers. However, the Von Erich mythology was still evident, particularly in the thumbnail sketches of the Five Sons. It listed Kevin's 1987 concussion in the ring in Fort Worth as attributed to having his head run into the ring post, which, while more believable than being hit with a dreaded Oriental tool punch, is no more accurate. It listed David's death as being from acute gastroenteritis and claimed he was the most popular wrestler in the family. Kerry was the most popular, although David was the most popular among promoters because he was the most reliable and considered the best worker. It also listed David as playing football and basketball at North Texas State University, which isn't technically true. He went to the school on a football/basketball scholarship, but didn't play football as a freshman and was redshirted in basketball his freshman year, then quit college and started pro wrestling at the age of 19. It listed Kevin as the first brother to turn pro. Actually, David was. Kevin joined him a few months later, both in 1977, although the article listed Kevin as 1978 and David as 1979. Admittedly minor errors. It listed Kerry as turning pro in 1980. Actually, it was Thanksgiving of 1978 when he started during college break but was full-time by the summer of 1979. Claiming he dropped out of college when President Carter ordered the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, since the article claimed he was an Olympic discus prospect. He could have been a possibility, although the odds against it would have been strong, given continued improvement over the years, but not until the 1984 or 1988 Olympics. There are plenty of state high school champions and even state record holders, and very few spots on the Olympic team. Kerry would have been only 20 at the time of the 1980 games, and his best collegiate throw of 178 feet was nowhere close to what would have been needed to have made the U.S. team. His coaches thought he did have the athletic potential, but for every top athlete, there are often dozens with equal or more potential that don't go as far. His discus prowess and the subsequent boycott were put together as part of the family mythology used for wrestling angles. He was talked about as a medal favorite on the wrestling shows in early 1980 before the Olympic trials when Heels injured his shoulder just prior, keeping him from attending the tryouts he was never going to in the first place. Kerry had been wrestling full-time and had given up serious discus training long before the boycott was called, although his former college track coach confirmed that his father wanted him to stay in college. It listed the crowd at Texas Stadium for the famous Flair-Kerry match in 1984 as 43,013 when it was actually 32,123. That 43,000 figure has been used so many times over the years that, like many exaggerations in every form of media, when repeated often enough, it becomes the truth. Admittedly, it's hardly the first exaggerated crowd figure used in the entertainment world, but the real number isn't much of a secret either. In the story, Jack swore that he never wanted his sons to follow him in the ring. This contradicts the fact he seemingly had planted the seeds for it when they were teenagers by talking about them and featuring them on television before they even started wrestling, and even as much as got other NWA promoters who were his friends like Sam Mushnick to begin talking about his sons when they were still in high school, with a ridiculous push all received long before they were ready. When Kevin, David and Kerry were 18, 17 and 15 respectively, Jack introduced them at the NWA annual convention, telling the other promoters that his 3 boys would all be future NWA champions. After Jack's retirement match in 1982, all 5 sons were brought together in an interview, and Fritz saying how all 5 would someday be NWA champion. "Man, I did everything in the world to keep my kids out of this damn business," he said. But it was all they knew. A lot of boys don't want to follow in their father's footsteps. But there are those who do. Everybody likes recognition. They saw me getting a lot of it. They idolized me. I trained, it was on television, a big name, why wouldn't they want the same thing? It was as natural as anything in the world. If somebody has the gall to say that I forced my kids and I'm responsible for their deaths in any way, shape or form, it makes me want to get a .45 and shoot somebody right in the ass. It burns me up. The story quoted Kevin as saying David's death was the beginning of the end. Kevin claimed David's death burned out his heart, while Jack, who ran the promotion, said that he lost his initiative and desire. For all real purposes, Jack got out of the wrestling business after the death of Mike, although still had a major financial interest in the company and did the infamous heart attack angle after Mike's death. Jack also talked of a fight the two had just before Mike's suicide. Jack claimed Mike was drunk when he sternly scolded him for his series of legal transgressions which went public after his near-fatal bout with toxic shock syndrome. Mike responded by kicking his father in the groin and Jack knocked him down. It also noted that Jack was the only member of the family not mentioned in Mike's suicide note. It did note that Mike wasn't particularly athletic. The story of how heavily hyped his return to the ring after suffering brain damage and a loss of equilibrium from the toxic shock, with Jack pushing him as the living miracle and promising he'd return to win championships, which some would say was the most telling sign all about things being out of control, wasn't brought up. It talked of Chris's suicide as despondency after being told by doctors that he couldn't wrestle again. The sidebar story also talked of benevolent endeavors that had become the family's trademark. April 26, 1993. From several reports, Kevin Atkinson, Kevin Von Erich, held up GWF promoter Gray Pearson for $1,000 cash before the show on the April 2 benefit show at the Sportatorium for his nieces. All the wrestlers had agreed to work the card with no payment, since it was advertised that all the proceeds would go into a trust fund for the 2 young daughters of his late brother Kerry. Pearson had agreed to reimburse wrestlers for transportation costs and had told wrestlers that if they had to cancel a prior booking in order to appear on the show, that he would reimburse them for missing the booking. None of the wrestlers on the show asked for any money for either transportation or reimbursement for canceling a prior engagement besides Kevin. Kevin claimed he had a prior booking that night in Birmingham, Alabama, which brought with it a $1,000 payoff. We have no record of any such a show in Birmingham on that evening that Kevin would have been booked on, let alone had been promised that kind of a payoff, which would be labeled as very unusual in the independent market for a wrestler of Kevin's caliber, but not necessarily impossible. Kevin is believed to be on a tour of Nigeria, so nobody has heard his side of the story. According to other reports, there was no show in Birmingham and the promotion paid him the money before the show, figuring his no showing that particular event would cause numerous problems, especially with the potential fear that should he not appear that his father might choose to leave with him. Wrestlers holding up promoters at the last minute and promoters underpaying wrestlers what they promised ahead of time is as old as the wrestling business itself, which doesn't make it correct, but in many ways this is almost inherently in many cases an unscrupulous business. However, this particular incident of doing so on a benefit show where everyone else on the card gave up their Friday night and worked for free on a benefit show for one's own nieces does seem to set new record in that regard. Speaking of the Von Erichs, Texas Magazine, a Sunday newspaper supplement similar to Parade, will be doing another major feature on the family. Based on what I'm told, Jack Atkinson is a lot more open about certain things in this article as compared with previous ones. May 17, 1993. The television show A Current Affair will be doing a segment on the Von Erichs tentatively either on Monday, May 17th or Thursday, May 20th according to the latest reports from those with the show. The piece will definitely run during May because the show feels the story is prime sweeps material. May 24, 1993. A Current Affair ran its entire May 17th show on the Atkinson/Von Erichs, which revolved around interviews with on May 17th, which revolved with Jack and Kevin. The piece has already come under heavy criticism because of what was left out, but in defense of the piece, and only a little defense is deserved, there was only so much you can air and say in 30 minutes on a story that would need to be a 4-part miniseries to do justice to. The interview of Jack was really telling and deserving of the time allotted. They spent too much time interviewing Kevin and left unanswered all the questions that a viewer would be interested in after seeing the piece, many of which have answers. Overall, I'm not as negative on it as most, although there was a lot left out that the producers knew about that probably needed to somehow be included. The story couldn't be done without making clear that Jack owned the wrestling company his sons worked for and controlled the fact that his sons were always on top and won almost all of their matches. Their superstardom was not a result of their athletic ability, although some were good athletes, but of Jack's marketing the family name and his obsession with making his sons the superstars that they weren't equipped to be. How that key point could be left out no matter how tight things were hurt the story. While a minor point, reporting that the Kerry Von Erich Ric Flair match drew 43,000 people, no matter how many times it is reported, is not true, and by virtue of the fact that producers had the issue of The Observer in their hands putting together that piece, there is no excuse for that error, no matter how minor. It also had Jack talk about how nobody knew about Kerry wrestling with a prosthetic leg. This was reported in a Dallas newspaper in 1988 and was the subject of major controversy within the industry that year, which also was mentioned in that same Observer. But the capper, which would have ruined the piece no matter what, was Maureen O'Boyle's closing line about Kevin still being an international superstar who only works in this country on charity shows. Yes, the producers of the piece were aware of what happened at the Sportatorium when Kevin held up promoter Gray Pearson at his own niece's benefit show for a $1,000 payoff, claiming a cancelled booking that there is no evidence existed. And to classify Kevin Von Erich today as anything but a superstar of a decade ago who has fallen to the ranks of being a non-entity in the wrestling business would be inaccurate. For whatever positive and negative one can say about the piece, the final line sealed it as overall negative. May 31, 1993. Another correction or retraction. After viewing the A Current Affair piece twice more this week, last week's comments on the piece were far too favorable. While the piece was well produced visually and interesting to watch, the overall impression it gave is misleading, and it seemed they ignored any evidence that would answer the questions the viewers wanted most. Watching the piece left me with the impression that the deal that was made to get all classic home footage and wrestling footage included going along with Von Erich mythology in most cases without question, and in some cases with just perfunctory questioning. The reader's pages. Von Erich. The name Lester Maddox, who you confused with George Wallace since Maddox was the former governor of Georgia, not former governor of Alabama, which was Wallace, as was stated in The Observer, and the incident about his refusing to serve blacks at his restaurant brings to mind a comment I'd like to make about the recent resignation of Bill Watts in the South during the 1960s as opposed to the 1990s. I was born in Atlanta in 1958 and lived there until I went to college in North Carolina in 1976. I moved north of the Mason-Dixon line in 1980 and have stayed north since. Having lived the years at which I was most impressionable and the years which I was growing up in Atlanta, I find myself with interesting background to offer. Lester Maddox was a career politician who made what little money he did by running a fried chicken restaurant right near Georgia Tech. The restaurant was, I believe, called the Pickaxe, but I could be wrong. The Pickaxe is, to this day, what many longtime Atlantans remember about Maddox. Around 1964, the southeastern United States was just beginning to enter the era of immigration, both forced and otherwise. It is not so much there were all these white-only and black-only restaurants, but more than blacks didn't go into white areas or vice versa. Such was the literal segregation of 1964, even though the war between the states had ended roughly 100 years earlier. Even today it is very difficult to explain the mindset of a Southerner of the 60s to those who weren't there at the time. It's not so much that racism was accepted, or that it was tolerated. It just was. One day, one or more black men tried to enter Lester's restaurant and Lester chased them out with a pickaxe handle. He was widely quoted as saying he felt he should be able to serve whom he wished. This wasn't an uncommon view of white men in the South. Governor Wallace of Alabama had defied the federal government and blocked the hallways of one Alabama school and all schools to blacks just 1 year earlier. As late as 1964, Bull Connor was still attacking black marchers in Birmingham with huge hoses of water. Not only did many white Southerners not flinch with what Maddox had done, many dismiss it to this day as nothing more than a political stunt. Lester had already decided to run for governor, and the notoriety he got didn't hurt him in the white rural parts of Georgia. The epilogue to this story is that after Lester finished his political career, he opened up a restaurant in the mid-70s in Sandy Springs, a fairly ritzy Atlanta suburb, and served everyone who walked through the door. If Maddox ever truly felt the way he did in 1964, and I have met him a few times and doubt it, he certainly had changed in 1974. That's more than can be said for some people. I just hope no comments I ever make in my newsletter cost somebody his or her job and livelihood. Almost everyone I've talked to said the death of Andre the Giant hit home harder, but not to me, than Kerry Von Erich. To me, Andre was more a freak attraction than a pro wrestler. I've always enjoyed the athletic side of the sport, maybe from growing up in an area headlined on top by Mr. Wrestling, Dory Funk, Jack Briscoe, and Terry Funk, and going to college during the heyday of the Mid-Atlantic territory that had the very best wrestlers in the world. That's what I grew up thinking pro wrestling was, not Andre the Giant's. And what a wrestler Von Erich was. At one time he was my favorite wrestler. Has anyone ever matched the admittedly steroided muscled look with so much pure athletic ability and grace? And what drop kicks? At a heavy 260, Von Erich could get up there with the best and lightest of them all. I remember a classic 60-minute straw with Ric Flair on February 12, 1985 in Honolulu, where Kerry did a better drop kick at the 56 minutes mark of what was already an all-time classic match than most wrestlers can ever do. We all know how tough Japanese fans are. During the third fall of Flair's May 24, 1984 winning of the NWA title in Yokosuka, Von Erich whipped Flair into the rope and did a standing dropkick so well, 27 minutes into the match, that the fans started applauding. Flair may have helped Kerry in these matches, and Kerry may have been given a crash course in wrestling in 1984 by Dory Funk before winning the title, but he was a top 20 worker with a meteoric rise from good to great until 1985. I guess he realized he was never getting the NWA title back. The thought was also what ended Kevin's desire, wasn't it? What happens to our idols when the only spotlight they'll accept is the main one? Don't they all self-destruct when it's not there for them anymore? And so it goes. Steve Sims. Chicago, Illinois. Maybe I'm naive and maybe I'm insensitive, but how could Kerry Atkinson take his own life after seeing and experiencing firsthand the grief his brother's suicides caused his family? I've spoken with friends and coworkers who aren't wrestling fans, but since this is Texas, they are familiar with the Von Erich family's tragedies, and they also wonder how all this can happen to one family. I remember firsthand the glory days of world-class championship wrestling, and it just amazes me how much tragedy has struck the alumni of that once great company, not just the Von Erichs, but Gino Hernandez, Bruiser Brody, and Ralph Pulley. Each report sickened me a little more, and I can only imagine what Jack and Doris Atkinson must be thinking and feeling. Regardless of their problems outside the ring, a lot of us here regard the Von Erichs as like family, and losing one of them is like losing one of our own, but it's impossible to rationalize the last 3 deaths. Rob Moore. Corpus Christi, Texas. I just read about Kerry Von Erich's suicide in the Boston Herald, and the only thing I can feel is sadness. As much as I knew Kerry had his share of problems, I never thought it would come to this point. I met Kerry for the first and last time at John Arezzi's convention in New York. Even though he seemed a bit perplexed, he was cordial and happy. I talked with him for a few minutes, and he was pretty confident he'd be with the NWA soon. I saw him later that day signing autographs before I had to fly back to Boston. We all know of the stories behind the Von Erichs and what kind of lifestyle they led, but any loss in wrestling is a tragedy. We've lost a big part of wrestling with Andre and Kerry, 2 of the most popular wrestlers in history. Whatever bad publicity came out of World Class and Fritz Von Erich, there is no justification for the loss of a son, let alone 5 sons. Vince Carolyn, Stoughton, Massachusetts. I can't even begin to express my anger and disbelief about Kerry Von Erich's death. I kept thinking after his arrest that suicide may be where he was headed. I'm thoroughly upset that 3 Von Erichs have ended their own life since 1987. What the hell went on in their childhood that would lead to this? I've never heard of 3 family members anywhere committing suicide. A friend of mine said Fritz must have been a horrible father. Unfortunately, I'm inclined to believe that. Everything you learn in your childhood affects your adult life. Most children learn a majority of the facts of life from their parents. I'm full of anger more than anything. Why would 3 young men kill themselves? a permanent solution to temporary problems. All of the Von Erichs have lived reckless, irresponsible lives, so I guess they believed ending your own life is the way to do things. William Morris, Gainesville, Florida. Listening to Tom Sawyer by Rush over the weekend made me recall great memories of a lost era. Kerry Von Erich was one of the most popular and athletically gifted wrestlers this sport has ever seen and probably will ever see. The rise and fall of Kerry Von Erich is the most tragic story pro wrestling has ever seen. Too many people in this business have died from drug-related and self-induced deaths like Buzz Sawyer, Jay Youngblood and Gino Hernandez among others. I've never heard of any other sport where so many athletes have died at a young age directly, or indirectly, from drug abuse. I just pray this trend doesn't continue. Regardless of all the negative things that have surrounded the life of Kerry Von Erich, I will always remember him as the modern-day warrior who thrilled fans worldwide with his great battles against Ric Flair, the Freebirds, Gino Hernandez, and Chris Adams. I find it very disheartening that neither the WWF or WCW have even made a mention of Kerry's passing. I guess I should have come to the realization by now that we are living in a world where a nonsensical film can be made to promote a strap match, but a brief feature on a fallen superstar is out of the question. Charles Warburton, Staten Island, New York. So the demons finally got to Kerry Von Erich. Your article on this famous family was the best piece I have ever read regarding wrestling. It makes me so sad to think about the hardships that have taken the Von Erich sons away, and it makes me sick to think what Fritz did. But I will continue to think of the good times, watching Kerry come down the aisle in his majestic robe and seeing the girls pull at him from all sides, stopping to hug them and let them adore him. Jeff Morris, Nashville, Tennessee. DM, there's so much to be learned from the saga of Kerry Atkinson. But almost none of it is through focusing the remembrances on the fantasy. Doing that only sows the seeds to enable another similar situation to happen because people only dealt with the fantasy and thus ignored the lessons that reality should have taught. Your piece on Kerry Atkinson's death was very well thought out, treating his death not like an isolated event but rather the culmination of a story that had been building for more than a decade. Kerry's fate was all too predictable to those who have followed the story. While I hope the story ends here, I can recall Kevin Atkinson appearing on a tabloid program last year and touting his own son to lead the next generation of Von Erichs destined to star in the ring. Name withheld by request. Your coverage of the death of Kerry Von Erich and of the Von Erich family was truly a brilliant piece of journalism. What a tragedy. I would like to point out that I met Kerry twice during the mid-1980s through my work with an airline and found him to be extremely friendly and personable. Those meetings with him will always make me think of him in a favorable way. Ken Capps, St. Louis, Missouri. The tragic saga of the Von Erich family not only saddens me but also as a parent, troubles me greatly. Your March 1st issue left me stunned. What a terrible, terrible waste of life to a family that gave us so much entertainment over the years. Charles Benson, Montgomery, New York. The articles on Andre the Giant and Kerry Von Erich were both classics. In both cases you managed to look beneath the surface and get to the people, and not just to the names listed on the booking sheets. Also, for the record, I think Bill Watts was headed in the right direction at WCW. I think it's a damn shame they didn't give him 2 years. Keith Priest, Kennesaw, Georgia. For some reason, tragedies have brought out the best in your writing. Though Andre was long past his prime, you correctly established the charisma and promotion that made him genuinely so popular in the 70s. I felt a real sense of loss with his death. Your article on Kerry Von Erich was a masterpiece. You're correct in your assessment that he was one of the best of his decade, but he also had decidedly never realized his potential. Fritz Von Erich is a pathetic creature who now must live out his days in unspeakable agony. For the first time, I actually felt sorry for Kevin. John Jantz, Fresh Meadows, New York. I was going to write and tell you that the Andre the Giant story was the best you've ever written. That was before the Kerry Von Erich story. You covered every aspect of the story. I have sympathy for the family, but Fritz has to be held accountable. All in all, an incredible piece of journalism. About Bill Watts resigning, while the Observer is not a forum for political debate, several of Watts' points were valid. In a free society, individuals should be able to operate a private business any way they want. I feel his use of derogatory slang phrases of minorities are what caused all the stir. It's disappointing that words are taken more seriously than action today. I agree with you when you said it is more serious when a company uses racial angles than its vice president using poor judgment with words. Does TBS know the past history of Ole Anderson when it comes to race-baiting angles? Is he really any better or worse than Watts? Paul Nucci, Ypsilanti, Michigan. In none of the stories on the Von Erichs, either in the sheets or in the mainstream press, was it ever mentioned that clinic depression as a result of getting off steroids when addicted can contribute to suicides. Is that likely, or it just one of 100 reasons Carrie may have had? Mike McNulty. San Francisco, California. DM, I think the reasons for Carrie were pretty obvious, and I don't think steroids played a major cause. I've often wondered about the possibility of steroids being a small factor with his brothers. It's something we'll never really know. On February 18, 1993, the world of professional wrestling suffered a loss of such magnitude that unfortunately it will never be truly realized. Kerry Von Erich was not just a fellow wrestler, he was a friend. I probably could go on and on about my friend, but there would not be enough space to print it all. There were good things and bad things about Kerry Jean Atkinson. But thank God the good certainly outweighed the bad. The Bible says that those without sin cast the first stone. There isn't one of us who can pick up a single rock. My friend was a very troubled man. He was a man who suffered pain almost every day of his adult life. Countless people tried their level best to help him, but he was the only one who could help himself. He was standing knee-deep in water, but he was dying of thirst. They say a man stands tallest when he bends over to help a child. I wish I could count the number of times I saw my friend give comfort to a crippled or dying child. My friend never had a bad word to say about anybody. If you needed something and he had it, it was yours. There is no doubt in my mind that Kerry had the biggest heart in our sport, but my friend made a decision. It's a decision that we can't condone, but it was totally out of our hands. I would like to close with a few lines that are inscribed on the cornerstone of the British Museum in London. They shall not grow old. As we who are left grow old, age will not weary them, nor the years condemn the going down of the sun. And in the morning, we will remember them. May Kerry rest in peace. A peace he was never able to find for himself here with us. Anonymous friend. The article written on the death of Kerry Von Erich moved me very much. I don't think all of the blame should go against Jack Atkinson. Kerry was an adult who had severe drug problems. I remember stories of Kerry doing independent cards in 1987 where a promoter would send Kerry the money in advance and Kerry would never make the match. I never met any of the Von Erichs, but I enjoyed watching them work. There must have been deeper problems than Jack Atkinson would admit to. I think wrestlers who do jobs are underpaid, underappreciated, and oftentimes abused. One instance that stands out is when someone told one of the stars to go out and kick the teeth out of a jobber on a television taping. I don't think this is right. Many jobbers such as George South, Rip Rogers, and Mike Jackson really carried and called most of the spots and had to make the matches themselves with big superstars like Lex Luger, Sid Aoudi, and Nikita Koloff. Chris Rose. Big Stone Gap, Virginia. I'm currently employed at the airport Radisson in Philadelphia where the Pro Wrestling Convention was held in late January. On that Sunday, I was surprised to see Kerry Von Erich still there as the rest of the boys had already left. He was very polite and said, "Hey brother," and walked onto his room. A few minutes later he called down for baking soda. Drug users I know tell me that baking soda breaks up cocaine to cut out lines easier. I took the baking soda to him and knowing his history, I had my suspicions. He called me back about 30 minutes later and got 6 Coors Lights for himself. Friends of his were waiting in the hotel bar and bragged to my girlfriend, the bartender, that Kerry Von Erich was on his way down. His friends got tired of waiting for him finally and left. Kerry showed up 2 hours late, visibly chemically induced. He was glassy-eyed, licking his lips, grabbing his nose, shaking uncontrollably, and ordering beers like they were going out of style. He started scamming by telling my girlfriend they don't have a clue, said she was gorgeous. I've warned her about wrestlers, so she blew it off. I then entered the bar and he realized she was my girlfriend. To my surprise, he respected that and left her alone at that point. He and I began to talk and he attempted to work me. He told me that I, 6 foot, 190, could be wrestling's next big star. I told him that I've worked, in some forms in the business for 6 years and was smart, but it didn't stop him from fabricating stories the rest of the evening. He said he had signed a 2-year deal with ABC Sports, a 2-year deal with ESPN, was filming a movie, and was currently the world heavyweight wrestling champion. He asked a cook to crack his back for him, then begged him for a free steak. He told the cook in return he'd get him front row seats to any wrestling card he wanted for his trouble. He talked about fictitious security guards sleeping in his hotel room to protect him from being mobbed by all the fans. He also started showing around a Polaroid of a girl with a beer bottle shoved in her, and was laughing about it. He made up a reason that he said was why he, Hulk Hogan, and the Ultimate Warrior had quit the WWF. He told me he made $1.3 million at WrestleMania. I then mentioned I knew Jerry Lawler, hoping he'd realize I knew he was lying and he'd stop. He instead then said the Las Vegas oddsmakers had 7-1 that he would lose the Superclash match with Lawler, that a fan before the match stabbed him in the bicep and that the Mafia that threatened the referee and that's why the match was stopped. At the beginning, all of this was humorous until I realized he was out of it. He then threw darts at the dartboard from a dangerously long distance and continued to tell me that I had to look to be a star either as a good guy or a bad guy. It almost seemed to me as if he wasn't even smart to his own business. Next, a flight attendant came in a near-empty bar and he literally smothered her with stories of how big a star he was. The only problem was this was in 1993, not in 1984. She was visibly annoyed and left. He then asked me and others to take him to Club Manhattan, a local bar. I declined. As much of a mark as I am, he was just too scary to be with. He just sat there for the last 30 minutes staring sadly in a mirror and writing on a napkin. He left the bar and asked us to call him a cab and call his room when it got there so he could party some more at Club Manhattan. I read the napkin and it said, "Woe is me," or is it wow? Kerry Von Erich is leaving the bar. This stunned me. Later I went by the club on the way home and saw Kerry leaving the club alone. He hugged the doorman at the club and got back in his cab. That was the last time I saw him. I went to my girlfriend's house and told her they'd probably find Kerry dead of a suicide in his hotel room. She told me he'd sleep it off. I was 3 weeks early. Earlier that same evening, the cook had asked him about his brothers, and he, almost with pride, bragged about their suicides. They also had a front desk girl call the nightclub to make sure security was there because the world-famous Kerry Von Erich was on his way. This is a sad, sad story. His constant self-delusions and blatant lying were from a guy who was crying out for help. I've met nearly everyone in the wrestling business and been around people who have been very depressed, myself included. But I've never seen anybody so screwed up in my life. It's a real shame because without drugs, I believe he and probably his 3 brothers would still be alive today. Beyond all the things I wrote, Kerry seemed like a likable guy and still had a natural presence that people could tell he was somebody without him pounding it down their throat. I know one thing, I'll never forget what happened that night. Tom Robinson. Clifton Heights, Pennsylvania. The judge presiding in Kerry Von Erich's drug case, in my opinion, tarnished the dignity of the court by the callous remark that Kerry's suicide was taking the coward's way out. As a lawyer myself, I realize how crucial it is for judges to maintain a benevolent impartiality. It is beneath the dignity of a judge to chide the memory of a defendant facing criminal charges for committing suicide. As an official of the state of Texas, the judge has nothing to complain about. If Kerry's latest problems constituted a violation of his probation, then his suicide saves the state the money that would have been expended in prosecuting and imprisoning him for whatever length of time. The least any official of the state's criminal justice system can do is keep a respectful silence and not make unnecessary comments that only further intensify the pain of Kerry's surviving family. His daughters don't need to hear their deceased father contemptuously taunted by a vindictive judge, who regrets losing the opportunity to punish somebody. Edward Tabash. Beverly Hills, California. The news of Kerry Atkinson's suicide stunned me completely. I slowly lowered and shook my head while pondering this latest chapter of wrestling's saddest story. I thought not just of Kerry, but also of David, Mike, and Chris. I thought of how the Von Erich name, one synonymous with success and innovation, has become equivalent with fleeting glory, tragedy, drugs, and death. It reminds me of how fleeting success, glory, and fame really can be. However, I've been truly saddened by reading letters from people who have written in and spoke of only remembering the Von Erich glory days. While I too will remember the enjoyment received from watching them, in no way can that memory override the lessons to be learned from their story. In no way can I allow myself to ever forget the price they paid for their lifestyle. To forget would only eliminate the lessons to be learned. Michael McGowan. Jerseyville, Illinois. I found the article on the Von Erichs one of the most fascinating articles I've ever read on any personalities. I think the main crime perpetrated is that Jack imposed his own subjective fantasy/reality existence on his children. If they were left to lead their own lives, I'm sure things would have turned out differently for all of them. Maybe the worst thing that ever happened was all his children were born males. Paul Hollister. San Diego, California. The harsh and final reality of the Von Erich fantasy should send a message to every wrestling fan in the world. It was probably the best thing I've ever read in The Observer. Kurt Gardner. San Pedro, California. I hope this will be the last letter about Kerry Von Erich. For those that don't know, Mr. Von Erich died some months ago. Why don't we just let him rest in peace? Yeah, I know he was no angel while he was alive, but who is? After seeing so many letters, good and bad, and mainly reading the letter by Tom Robinson in The Observer, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Kerry is not here to defend himself about what happened that weekend, or any other weekend. I'm sure some of what is in there is true. I've met Kerry on more than one occasion and could dedicate an entire Observer to what I saw, but I wouldn't because I have ethics. I'm not trying to take his side or defend him. I'm just sick of reading about him. His lifestyle eventually caught up with him. End of story. My mom always told me that if you don't have anything good to say about someone, don't say anything. When I hear Rush's Tom Sawyer, I see the modern-day warrior in all his glory. That is the Kerry Von Erich I choose to remember. Maybe it should be the one everyone else remembers, but if not, don't take up space in The Observer with stories about a guy that isn't here anymore. How do you think his family feels when they hear this? Not good. Stu Kaplan. North Weymouth, Massachusetts. It was either the biggest whitewash in tabloid TV history, or it demonstrated the ignorance of most mainline journalists when covering serious issues involving pro wrestling. In the last 9 years, 2 sons died of alleged drug overdoses and 2 others were the victims of self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Yet, to the untrained viewer, the current affair story was a half hour of bringing out the violins for Fritz and Kevin. Correspondent John Johnson depicted a tale which resembled the exaggerated glorification of the Kennedys. Johnston failed to zero in on what led 4 sons to turn to drugs and suicides. He failed to detail the decline of the family's ring popularity. What about previously published charges that Fritz pushed his sons to the top in wrestling before they were capable of handling the adulation and pushed them above more talented veterans? You didn't see that on A Current Affair. What about the allegations that the Von Erichs used a connection to Pat Robertson and appearances on the 700 Club to paint a squeaky clean family image picture to the public? Then, there was host Maureen O'Boyle's footnote that Kevin is still an international star but only wrestles in charity events in this country. In the last 4 years, Kevin's wrestling endeavors are almost non-existent. Further, as to O'Boyle's charity assertion, why didn't A Current Affair bring up Kevin's demanding a $1,000 fee to wrestle at the recent Dallas benefit card for his own 2 nieces when every other wrestler on the card agreed to wrestle for free? A Current Affair was provided with a signed receipt for the $1,000 payoff. It was neither used, nor even cited. The closest to an honest portrayal of the Von Erich saga came in a poignant moment toward the end. Johnson acknowledged Jack's wife of 42 years, Doris, left him. Until Kerry, she never blamed me for the deaths of any of my sons, he said. Now, she blames me. Steve Beverly. Jackson, Tennessee. I watched the Current Affair piece on the Von Erichs, and your issue went far more about explaining the situation and events and the family's history building up to each death. Given if they had enough time, I would have expected the same from them, but taking into account the time they did have for the story, I think they did as good a job as they could in giving different views and opinions of those involved. I found the comments by Fritz interesting. I still can't get over how both in this piece and in the New York Daily News article that Fritz denied wanting his sons to become wrestlers. He really doesn't expect anyone to believe that, does he? After all, the television clip where he is boasting about how all of his sons someday are going to be world champion hardly sounds like a father who didn't care whether his sons became wrestlers. The family certainly didn't live in reality. I hope Fritz can finally let go of the fantasy, but if not, it will be the saddest part of all of this. By the way, I couldn't stop laughing after reading Hogan's comments in Japan. Who can actually believe anything he says? If he meant what he said, he should have no problem dropping the WWF title or doing a clean job for Bret Hart and apologizing for letting his ego get in the way of common sense. Is it just me, or are Hogan's interviews the worst part of any WWF show? He doesn't seem to take wrestling seriously. Then again, I'm not sure he ever did. It kind of makes me miss Ultimate Warrior. The flair for the gold segments are great. The one with the Hollywood Blondes was hilarious. They are definitely the best tag team in the US. They are both great in the ring and on the mic and get better each week. Dan Bazarski. West Haven, Connecticut. Glad to read that you've revised your view of the A Current Affair story on the Von Erichs. It was pretty clear that Jack Atkinson has seized on the interviews in the wake of Kerry's death as his last shot at putting himself over $1,000 last time. The piece was disgusting. It was a perpetration of the mythology and lionization of Fritz Von Erich despite all the human cost. How dare his wife life him, after all? Kevin talking about how his son can become a wrestler if that's what he chooses to do was such an echo of Jack that it made my skin crawl. I wanted some Texas social service worker to see the report and understand the story and get those kids some help. I agree with you on the overall quality of the flair for the gold segments, but I'm surprised nobody has criticized the appalling sexism of the segments. It's overwhelming even by pro wrestling standards. Flair regularly parades Fifi. They make innuendos of having orgies with Missy Hyatt in the limo and dumping her by the side of the road. And they're supposed to be babyfaces for doing so because it's Missy Hyatt. Arnold Anderson at one point clearly tells Flair to calm down because they have broads to party with. Rick Rude presented Flair with a stripper, while Rude and Flair make more innuendos about swapping Fifi around. I realize much of Flair's gimmick is being the playboy of the Western world, but this stuff is pretty appalling. Stephen Grant. Tacoma, Washington. September 22, 1997. Fantasy versus reality. For most people in the real world, for the most part, they know the difference. In pro wrestling, among both its performers and its fans, sometimes the line gets a little blurred. Often that's dismissed as simply harmless. But sometimes when the line is blurred for long enough, or the difference is no longer perceptible, or even worse, when the fantasy becomes the reality, it creates a situation of potential danger. The danger is that the day may come when the bubble is burst and the fantasy is over and one isn't equipped to deal with the reality. From Death of a Dynasty, the March 1, 1993 edition of the Wrestling Observer. Jack Atkinson, easily among the most notable figures in the history of this industry, passed away on September 10 from cancer at the age of 68 at his home in Lake Dallas, Texas. Jack Atkinson was many things and many different people during his lifetime. He was Fritz von Erich, the monstrous post-World War II Nazi heel with the Iron Claw, one of the biggest stars with arguably the most famous finishing hold of his era. He was Jack Atkinson, a millionaire from the real estate industry who for nearly 2 decades was one of the leading promoters and most powerful figures behind the scenes in the pro wrestling world. He was the Texas-bred and Texas-fed local hero, the self-promoted toughest man alive in his own created fantasy world whose iron claw squeezed the blood in the heart out of every huge villain who crossed his path. He was the patriarch of the ultimate fantasy all-American family, almost a Texas version of the Kennedys, known as the Von Erichs, with an even more tragic end result. The Von Erichs were portrayed as clean-living, strongly religious, with off-the-charts athletic ability, all of whom were going to be world heavyweight champions, a fantasy of which exploded into the harshest of realities imaginable when his sons felt they couldn't live up their father's promotional image of them. He was the God-fearing all-American father who not only was able to sell his promotional fantasy to wrestling fans, but also moved in major religious circles with appearances on the 700 Club. He was a pioneer in modernizing pro wrestling on television. He had a unique ability to build up a major wrestling event as a high-class sports spectacular. He set new standards for poor taste that may never be equaled when it comes to promotion of wrestling. Within the state of Texas, and certainly the northern part, he was the single most famous pro wrestling personality of all time. He was large, rough, athletic, single-minded, had an amazing presence and was domineering of all who were around him. His life was, without question, one of the most incredible, bizarre, freakish roller coaster rides of twists and turns of anyone's. Some would say his life was the ultimate proof of karma. But even if it was, even then one has to question whether any man deserved the pain he had to live the last years of his life in. But no matter how bad he was, or how good he was, or what a huge star he was as an active wrestler and how many sellouts he drew, how powerful he was behind the scenes, one aspect of his life will far outshine all others. He had 6 children. 5 of them wrestled. Only one of them lived to see his 34th birthday. 3 of them had the potential to be and for a short time were among the very biggest stars in the industry. 4 of them died from either drug overdoses or suicide. Before there was Fritz von Erich, there was the real-life Jack Atkinson. He grew up in East Dallas, went on to Southern Methodist University where he was a member of the 1949 football team which included college football legend Doak Walker. While in later years his accomplishments were exaggerated to being Walker's lead blocker and an all-conference lineman, he was actually a backup player who was only on the team 1 year because he lost his scholarship during the offseason when he violated team rules and got married. He did have potential as a track star, setting the school record in the discus, but because he lost his scholarship and left school, was never able to go farther with it, and years later, perhaps trying to live out a part of his life he never fulfilled, coached and bought his son Kerry steroids and succeeded in molding him into becoming one of the best high school discus throwers in the country. He had a tryout with the old Dallas Texans of the NFL, but failed to make it, and went to Canada to try and continue his football career. He wound up in Edmonton, Alberta, with the Eskimos, and crossed paths with Stu Hart in 1953. At the time Hart was the local wrestling promoter, whose Klondike Wrestling in Edmonton predated Stampede Wrestling in Calgary which started a few years later. Hart remembered training Atkinson, a 6'4", 275-pound agile man with huge thighs and small arms, breaking him in along with other future wrestling greats such as Ilio Di Paolo and his later huge rival, Gene Kiniski, and remembered DiPaolo getting the better of Atkinson in training. He lived in a trailer park on the Hart property with his wife Doris and newborn son, Jackie Jr. because men who combined his size with his agility and athletic ability were a rarity in wrestling in the 50s. He became an almost immediate star, and it was only a few years into his career that Fritz von Erich, master of the Iron Claw, was born. German heels, complete with goose step and paying homage to the Führer, flourished after World War II, few of whom actually had ever set foot in Germany in their lifetimes, similar to the proliferation of Hawaiians who masqueraded as sneaky Japanese salt-throwing heels. But none came close to rivaling Fritz von Erich, with his size, presence, big hands, sneer and deadly grip, where he would squeeze the temples of his opponent, usually resulting in gruesome blood and submission. He was remembered as the inventor of the face claw, and whether that is true or not, he certainly was most responsible for popularizing the move that was later copied by numerous German clawmasters of later generations, from Baron von Raschke to Killer Karl Krupp and others like Blackjack Mulligan, Blackjack Lanza, and Pak Song. He was already one of the top heels in the country by the late 50s. While wrestling out of Buffalo in 1959, he suffered the first of numerous family tragedies. His oldest of then 3 sons, Jackie Jr., at the time 6 years old, touched a live wire while he was outside during a storm, was given a major jolt and knocked unconscious. He fell into a puddle and drowned to death. It was about the same time that the second member of the Von Erich dynasty came along. Bill Shepard, who wasn't a relative, became younger brother Waldo von Erich to take advantage of the name Fritz had built. Since Fritz rarely returned east after the death of his first son, Waldo became the Von Erich that was a frequent challenger for WWF champion Bruno Sammartino in the Northeast, and was a headliner in the Cleveland and Buffalo areas where Fritz initially made the Von Erich name famous. Although his greatest success in the industry came years later, the only world title held by Fritz von Erich was a brief reign as AWA champion from July 27 through August 8 in 1963, winning the title from Verne Gagne in Omaha and losing it back in Amarillo. During that time period, Omaha, which had its own television and local promotion, sometimes recognized a different AWA champion than the rest of the promotion. Von Erich held the Omaha version of the title for a few weeks 1 year earlier, from July 31, 1962 through August 25, winning and losing it from Gagne. His national AWA title reign and second Omaha reign, since the bout was in Omaha and recognized nationally, started concurrently. However, the Amarillo match wasn't acknowledged in Nebraska, and Von Erich remained as champion for 5 more weeks before losing to Gagne on September 7, 1963 in Omaha. To this day, Fritz and Kerry Von Erich remain the only father-son combination to have held major versions of the World Heavyweight title. Members of both the Guerrero and Dantes family in Mexico have had father-son NWA lighter weight titles, with Kerry capturing the NWA title from Ric Flair on May 6, 1984 in their famous Texas Stadium match, and losing it back to Flair on May 24, 1984 in Yokosuka, Japan. At the same time, he was one of the top heels in the country, cherry-picking top dates and numerous territories at the same time while being based out of Dallas. He was making a small fortune in the real estate market during boom periods in the Dallas area. In St. Louis, considered in many circles as the wrestling capital of North America, he is to this day considered, along with Buddy Rogers and Dick the Bruiser, as one of the 3 biggest drawing heels in the history of the city. He was also a key figure in the re-establishment of pro wrestling as a major draw in Japan in the wake of the death of its biggest star, Rikidozan, in late 1963. Because the Japanese magazines regularly covered the U.S. scene, the top stars in the United States like Bruno Sammartino, Kiniski, and Bobo Brazil could come to Japan and draw based on photos of them in main events around the U.S. Von Erich fit into that category and was a superstar in the Orient before he ever stepped foot on Japanese soil because of 2 victories using his Iron Claw over Antonio Inoki in 1965 in Texas. It wasn't until November 28, 1966, that Von Erich first came to Japan. His wins over Inoki and reputation from the U.S. set up the natural meeting against the Japanese Wrestling Association's top star, Giant Baba, in Osaka for the international title. Baba won their first meeting via countout, but submitted to the claw in the second fall and was bloodied up by the giant hands. This set up one of the biggest matches in Japan of the era on December 3, 1966 at Budokan Hall, where Baba retained the title, winning via DQ, which was notable for 2 other factors. It was the first time pro wrestling ever sold out Budokan Hall. It was also famous for one of the funniest things ever in a major match in Japan. Von Erich used the Iron Claw and Baba went to blade his forehead. Baba accidentally scraped the blade instead of across his forehead, across the fingers of Von Erich, who was bleeding badly from the fingers. Since this match aired live on national television at about 8 p.m. on a Friday night and drew an incredible rating, The press quickly had to come up with the cover story that Von Erich went into the match with a painful hangnail. After just those 2 matches, Von Erich had surpassed Kinski, Destroyer, Fred Blassie, Bruno and Bobo as the biggest foreign heel in Japan. As famous as Von Erich was to the general public non-wrestling fan in Japan, largely stemming from that famous match, it paled in comparison to the term Iron Claw, which surpassed the vampire teeth of Blassie, the cocoa butt of Bobo, and the figure 4 of Destroyer as the most feared maneuver in Japan. The success of that move may have been the first example of blurred reality in the Von Erich wrestling family. Atkinson was a large, strong man with huge hands and a strong grip. If he really put the claw on a man's temples, with his grip, it hurt like crazy, but it was not a death grip either. While he used to brag about the power of the claw in his wrestling interviews, and with his demonstrative style and direct voice which made him one of the greatest pro wrestling interviews that ever lived, he was able to sell himself in the hold. But he also liked to brag about it outside the ring, which resulted in 2 famous humorous incidents. Once in San Antonio on a television show when he was in the middle of a run of weekly sellouts on top at the most feared heel in the city, he bragged about nobody being able to break the hold. The sportscaster, thinking he was playing into the joke, challenged him to put it on, and he did, putting the pressure on. The sportscaster, who was starting to get in some pretty serious pain, responded with a claw of his own, to the testicles, and Fritz was in even greater pain, dropped his grip, and limped out of the television studio with his heel persona taking a beating in the city. Another was a time he was bragging about his hold backstage to the boys, saying nobody could break it. Danny Hodge, the perennial world junior heavyweight champion who legitimately pound for pound was probably one of the toughest men ever to walk planet Earth, accepted the challenge. Atkinson put the hold on and Hodge not only didn't sell but didn't even register any effectiveness of it. Finally Atkinson gave up the grip, walked away, swearing under his breath about being shown up. Seeing his and his hold's popularity, JWA protected Von Erich as the ultimate foreign monster heel by never having him lose conclusively in a singles match during that era. And with him running his own territory and not wanting to travel, his tours to Japan were rare, and he never appeared more than a week at a time, making his live appearances that much more important and only adding to his image and drawing power. He challenged for Baba's title on May 21, 1967, going to a double count out. 2 days later, teaming with Waldo, they lost to international tag team champions Baba and Michiaki Yoshimura. On May 24, Baba and Fritz met in a non-title match at the Dynasty Coliseum in Tokyo, with Fritz winning on a count-out in the 3rd fall, one of the very few losses Baba suffered during that era. This set up another title match 2 nights later in Sapporo, where Baba finally scored his elusive pin in the 3rd fall. However, there was still a measure of controversy since Baba's 2nd fall win was via DQ. It wasn't until March 3, 1970 when they were rematched in Nagoya, going to another double count-out. On the same tour, he teamed with Curtis Aokiya to lose, challenging for the international tag belts against Baba and Inoki. On September 4, 1971 they held another rematch at the Dynasty Coliseum, which Baba won via DQ. He also went to a double count-out 2 days later in Nagoya when challenging Inoki for the United National title, in what turned out to be their final singles match ever. After the big promotional split in the early 70s, where Baba left JWA and formed All Japan, Von Erich made one last JWA tour. On April 13, 1973 he challenged Korean legend Kim Il-Kintaro Oki, who had been chosen as Baba's replacement, as the top star and international champion, going to a double count-out. 5 days later in Yaizu, he teamed with Killer Karl Krupp as the Iron Claw Masters and beat Il and Umanosuke Ueda to win the international tag team titles. As it turned out, JWA then folded, and those tag titles wound up in the hands of Krupp and Carl von Steiger in the Amarillo territory, who lost them to the Funks, who brought the belts to All Japan, where they have remained ever since. Fritz debuted with All Japan in December, and challenged to Baba, now PWF champion, losing via DQ in the 3rd fall on December 13, 1973 in Osaka. Finally, the next night in Tokyo a rematch was held, one fall to a positive finish, with Baba finally gaining his elusive pinfall victory in 17-16. He only made 2 more tours of Japan, but by this time he was no longer the top foreign star. During the summer of 1975, he lost twice while challenging Jumbo Tsuruta for the United National title, and on July 25, in what is still the only gimmick match in the history of the All Japan promotion, he lost a Texas death match with no referee to Baba when he was knocked out and couldn't continue in 16-26 in a match billed to determine the number 1 contender for then world champion Jack Briscoe. His last tour was in January 1979, where he teamed with Baron von Raschke as the new Clawmasters tag team, lost a singles match to Tsuruta, But his prime order of business was bringing Bruiser Brody into Japan for his first tour and working with Brody to get him over in Japan as the generation's top foreign heel. In January 1965, he broke away from established promoter Ed McLemore in Dallas in one of the biggest promotional wars of that era. He rallied all the North Texas area wrestlers together and pulled out the rug from under McLemore to start his company, and with help from NWA member promoters like Sam Mushnick, Dory Funk Sr., Bob Geigel and others who he was a top draw with, parlayed his personal drawing power as leverage to get talent from them. He won the war and owned the Dallas wrestling territory. In the midst of the bitter fight, longtime Houston promoter Morris Siegel, who sided with McLemore in the fight, passed away of a heart attack which resulted in Paul Bosch running Houston. In the case of Mushnick, who he remained close with for decades, who pulled many of the strings to help him win his promotional war, he had to promise that when he won, that he would have to hire the key people he put out of business for the good of the business, which he did. So McLemore was still, to the public, the Dallas area wrestling promoter. By the summer of 1966, Fritz broke up his tag team with hated Hawaiian Japanese heel Duke Kiyomica, and started the feud that turned him babyface. He then, as many if not most wrestlers who doubled as owners of their territory did, built the company around himself, usually battling the charges of perennial rival, manager Gary Hart. Among his famous rivals were Kiyomica, Brute Bernard, Johnny Valentine, The Spoiler, Kinji Shibuya, Boris Malenko, Toru Tanaka, Missouri Mauler, The Blackjacks, Bruiser Brody, John Studd, Ox Baker, Stan Stasiak, Ken Patera, Ernie Ladd, Great Kabuki, and finally King Kong Bundy. A generation later, he built the company around not only himself but his sons, likely because he learned from the example of himself that building anyone else as the strongest character in the company would give that person the leverage to do to him what he was able to pull off. Shortly after winning the war and turning babyface locally, he slowed down when it came to working outside dates. He told the other promoters who wanted to use him at the time that he wanted to stay home and raise his family. In 1967, before a sellout crowd of 18,000 at the St. Louis Arena, he challenged Kinniski for the NWA title and said that if he failed to win the title, that he would never wrestle in St. Louis again. He lost and actually never returned to the city where he was such a powerful force until 1979 to supervise and play a minor role in the angle that made son David into a national superstar. While he was the top babyface in North Texas, he continued to work as the top heel in South and West Texas through the 60s, before scaling back his schedule to only his home area by the end of the decade, and for the rest of his career. By this point, he was among the most powerful individuals behind the scenes in the industry. The main Texas wrestling territory, a secondary territory, was in West Texas, based out of Amarillo, run by Dory Funk Sr., with Fort Worth running every Monday, Dallas every Tuesday, San Antonio every Wednesday, Corpus Christi every Thursday, and Houston every Friday had become the NWA's most lucrative territory by the early 70s, with the likes of Valentine, Wahoo McDaniel, Jose Lothario, Red Bastian, Stasiak, Thunderbolt Patterson among the headliners. It wasn't unusual for the top guys to pull in $2,500 to $3,000 in a good week, which was phenomenal money for that time. Atkinson ran the territory, heading the booking office, and for a booking fee supplied talent for Joe Blanchard, San Antonio and Corpus Christi, and Bosch Houston and surrounding cities, so he was running his own shows and making a percentage on everyone else's. He was considered the master of building the big show, which was usually himself challenging for the elusive NWA World title. While he had dozens of NWA title matches over the years, the most famous were in the late 60s at Texas Stadium when a no-DQ match with Kinniski ended with special ref Blanchard turning heel and throwing dirt in his eyes, an ending even more ironic years later since Blanchard and Atkinson wound up as hated enemies and promotional rivals in the early 80s, and the most famous match ever in that era of Texas wrestling, on June 24, 1972 at Texas Stadium, setting a state record of 26,339 fans to see Von Erich and Dory Funk Jr. battle to a 60 minutes draw in 105-degree temperature. The attendance mark lasted 12 years until the night Kerry beat Flair for the NWA title finally to the fans of North Texas, climaxing the 20-plus year tease of a Von Erich challenging for that title. Fritz Von Erich was considered a star of the caliber to be considered as world champion, but never held the NWA title. During the 60s, probably the main deciding factor between himself and Kinniski, a rival who he was good friends with until the mid-80s, was that the NWA in those days wasn't going to have a world champion with the name of Fritz Von Erich because the title itself was supposed to not be tarnished by a gimmick, such as an obvious fake name or gimmick-style performer, not to mention that current champ Lou Thesz would have been far more amicable about doing a job for Kinniski than Von Erich. Mushnick, who was the most influential man in choosing the champion, tried to pave the way for him to become champion years later by revealing his real name as Jack Atkinson. In the early 70s, amidst a major power struggle within the NWA, there was strong consideration given to making Fritz von Erich as world champion, although he'd used the dual name of Jack Atkinson for NWA title credibility. It never happened, but instead he wound up for a brief period of time as arguably the most powerful man in the industry. Mushnick had been president of the NWA on and off since its inception in 1948, and along with the credibility Thez as champion, had built the organization into the closest thing in modern history to a worldwide industry governing body. He solidified his power base, despite only running one city rather than a full-time territory, for getting the entire alliance out of an incredible amount of trouble in a Justice Department investigation of the industry which turned up activities like monopolistic practices, blacklisting of wrestlers and other unscrupulous behavior. Mushnick's close association with the veteran Congressman Mel Price kept him as the power force in control of the alliance through the 60s. However, by the early 70s, the younger promoters who weren't around to see him bail the alliance out of major problems wanted Mushnick out. A power struggle ensued, and in August of 1975, Atkinson was named president of the NWA, with the face-saving storyline being that Mushnick was retiring from the position and Atkinson, his longtime friend, was a hand-picked successor. While president, Atkinson brought his sons, Kevin, David and Kerry to the NWA conventions in Las Vegas and told everyone, almost arrogantly, how his kids were all going to someday be NWA world champions. At the time, Kerry, who was in 10th grade, was already heavily into steroids, and as Fritz later revealed after Kerry's death, he was the one who purchased them for him in their obsession with making him a stud football and track star in high school and eventually a champion pro wrestler. Although it took more than a decade for the job to be completed, many point to this as the beginning of the end of the NWA. Atkinson was supposed to retire as an active wrestler because of how it would look for the NWA president to be an active wrestler, particularly under the name of Fritz von Erich, but decided against it because he felt he needed to keep himself on top both to protect the business in his territory and make sure nobody else got over strong enough to fight him to take the territory. The president's job had in the past been, among other things, to book the world champion. However, with Atkinson wrestling and running his own territory, that job fell into the hands of Jim Barnett, who also became one of the true power forces in the industry. Atkinson cast the deciding vote in the decision to have Terry Funk beat Jack Briscoe and win the title in late 1975, and the world title itself changed at that point. When Mushnick booked the champion, while screw jobs and even more often time limit draws were plentiful, the champion always had to win the climactic match in every series against the challenger in order to preserve the idea that ultimately the champion was the top man in the business. After Mushnick left, screw jobs became the order of the day, and they became far more creative, and the champion won far less often, to the point the aura of the championship declined as the years went on, even though the belt itself was dominated by great workers such as Terry Funk, Harley Race, and Ric Flair. In addition, it became an every promoter for himself game rather than an alliance that protected all and thus maintained power. Moves, such as one to establish a national television show on cable years before Vince McMahon did such a thing, never got off the ground because nobody wanted television in their markets with wrestlers that they didn't control. In cities like Los Angeles, Atlanta and Detroit in the late 60s and early 70s, when a rival promoter would come into an NWA town, the NWA promoters would send all their top stars into the city for loaded-up shows that would knock the upstarts out of the box. By the latter 70s, this happened less and less, and promoters fended for themselves. Some lost wars or were weakened by non-NWA promoters, and by the time Vince McMahon came along and went national in 1984, the once-strong alliance was in shambles and was finished off easier than anyone could have imagined. The strength of Texas wrestling also started to fade by the late 70s. Fritz himself was past his prime, but still, like many in the same shoes, trying to protect his territory by keeping himself as the main star. When his sons started wrestling, they weren't an immediate super hit, and the other promoters in Texas didn't want to headline and build their city around them like Fritz's calculated long-term plan was in North Texas. Joe Blanchard had his own son, Tully, who he wanted to push, while Bosch had Gino Hernandez. The inevitable splits took place, and Texas became a war zone. After the Funk sold their promotion to Dick Murdoch and Mulligan and it went belly up, Southwest Sports expanded into Amarillo. They also began running the San Antonio area in a war with Blanchard. None of the companies at the time were particularly strong until a few events took place. Fritz had built up strong religious connections by the late 70s as a famous TV celebrity in the area who talked about religion as often as he could. Jack had claimed he was deeply moved by a sermon in 1974, and shortly thereafter a divine voice guided him to open his Bible to Psalms 23. Later, the same force somehow made him pull his car off the road and ponder his sons. A former best friend, not to mention virtually all his detractors, believed him to be less than sincere in his constant religious talk. As a former best friend stated, Doris, who was deeply religious, was threatening to kick him out. By this time, Jack had already conceptualized his all-American family of wrestling superstars, and to save his family and his dream, he became born again. In 1981, the local Christian broadcasting station began televising Atkinson shows, and called the show World Class Championship Wrestling, which later became the name of the promotion. The shows featured rock music videos, musical ring entrances, and production values far ahead of what had been the industry standard. The show started airing outside the territory on CBN stations, which started giving the Von Erich kids popularity outside Texas. The huge reactions to the rock ring entrances, which actually had started largely by Michael Hayes 5 years earlier in several other territories, and had been done in big matches in Japan dating back even farther, and even before that with Gorgeous George in the late 40s, gave ring introductions a level of heat and began the match with an excitement level other promotions couldn't compete with, and soon every name wrestler in the country had their own entrance song. The kids, David in particular, had already become major draws in St. Louis after Fritz put together an angle in 1979 where then world champion Harley Race juiced and submitted clean in the middle to David's iron claw in a tape that played around the country. His kids got over to the point that when any of them faced Ric Flair, they started drawing impressive crowds that on occasion hovered near 10,000. But business was hardly booming the rest of the time. In what was supposed to be the biggest show of 1992, Fritz held his personal retirement match at Texas Stadium on June 14, 1982, where he beat Bundy with a full head of hair, which true only 6,000 fans were in attendance in the 70,000-seat building. But in one of the legendary angles and feuds in pro wrestling history, on December 25, 1982 at Reunion Arena in Dallas, Terry Gordy slammed the cage door on Kerry Von Erich's head as he was challenging Flair for the title in a match with Michael Hayes as ref, which drew 12,000 fans and the first $100,000 gate ever in the state of Texas. It wasn't to be the last. Freebirds vs. Von Erichs were born. The Dallas territory became one of the hottest in the world, and world-class wrestling became well-known in the more than 60 markets that the tape played in, and gained particular popularity in, of all places, Israel. Nearly every Friday night they sold out the Dallas Sportatorium, and the big shows at Reunion Arena sold out the 17,500-seat building on 3 occasions that year. Kerry Von Erich probably trailed only Hulk Hogan as the most popular wrestler in the country, and with his rock star look and competition bodybuilder physique, was the bestseller of all the wrestlers on magazine covers. There's a lot of speculation about what could have happened in wrestling history if things had played out differently. Atkinson, who still wielded tremendous power in the NWA, pushed for David to become world champion. The plan at one point in 1983 was for, after the title was taken from Flair and given to Race, for David to win it on Thanksgiving night at Reunion Arena in a match David was to vow to retire from wrestling should he lose. As history shows, such a match never took place, and instead on that same night, Starrcade was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Flair regained the title from Race. There were several factors behind the scenes, but a key unanswered one is that suddenly Fritz simply stopped pushing for David to win the title, although there was a general feeling that David was being groomed for the belt. David died in Japan on February 10, 1984 at the age of 25, with numerous reasons being given depending on what day it was. The official cause of death was listed as an inflamed intestine, but it is generally believed that David went out on the town in Tokyo with Bill and Scott Irwin, who were wrestling as the Super Destroyers, drinking heavily at Ribera Steakhouse, then went back to his room and took Placidos, and died that night. When he wasn't in the lobby for the bus to take him to his first match on the tour, ref Joe Higuchi and wrestlers Bruiser Brody and Jerry Morrow broke into his hotel room and found him dead on the floor. Before the police came, as the story goes, a hotel room was cleaned out of the drugs by the wrestlers on the All Japan tour to save both the Von Erich name and the company reputation. Drug use was already epidemic in an industry which consisted of fast times, fast people and fast money, and likely worse in world-class wrestling and among the kids named Von Erich than anywhere else. There were numerous stories of aides trying to tell Fritz about the problems with his kids, and Fritz would hear nothing of it and fire the messengers. Through Fritz's ability at public manipulation, David died a hero's death, wrestling when he shouldn't, having a thrilling fight in Japan. Actually, he died the morning of his first match on that Japanese tour, where he took a kick in the wrong place. Within days, Heaven Needed a Champion became a record sold at the matches. Kerry vowed to win the title in memory of his brother. Fritz came out of retirement, and one of the biggest wrestling events of all time took place on May 6, 1984 in Texas Stadium, where 32,123 fans paid $402,000. at the time the second largest gate in North American pro wrestling history, as Kerry beat Flair for his short-lived NWA title run. Fritz was also 25% partner of Bill Watts for Watts House shows in the state of Oklahoma, which had its most lucrative year ever in 1984. In late 1983, Fritz had the chance to take over the prestigious St. Louis market. A promotional war had been going on with the NWA office, headed by Geigel, Race, Pat O'Connor and Vern Gagne, and an independent using a lot of wrestlers from Von Erich's rival Southwest Championship Wrestling run by Larry Matusik, Mushnick's protege. The established TV time slot on Channel 11 from the Mushnick days, which drew incredible ratings, was up for grabs as the station was about to drop the NWA. Mushnick, although retired from wrestling, still had the connections with the station and was maneuvering behind the scenes. At the same time, Vince McMahon Jr. was about to embark on step one of what would eventually completely change pro wrestling as we know it. Mushnick tried to maneuver Matusik and Fritz together and steer the TV in their direction, but the morning when the station was going to make its decision, Von Erich was approached by Matusik, but ultimately decided against running against his former NWA business rivals. McMahon flew in from Minneapolis, where he had just the day before, unbeknownst to anyone in wrestling, closed the deal to snag Hulk Hogan from Vern Gagne, showed in St. Louis for a meeting with the station. The station went with McMahon, after he offered them $2,100 per week for the time slot, the beginning of his buying established TV time in major markets that wrestling fans were used to seeing, which was the first big blow against the NWA in that era's wrestling war. World-class wrestling remained fairly prominent for a few more years, but bad taste locally began to develop when one tasteless and depressing incident occurred after another, some in the work, most outside of it. Another young star, Hernandez, overdosed on cocaine. The string of incidents destroyed the company, each taking the promotional life out of Fritz's spirit. Kerry was busted with drugs in his possession coming across the border from Mexico. The evidence mysteriously disappeared in the police station. Mike, who was never physically equipped to be a wrestler and was in the business largely because of his last name, and then pushed far too fast as the next David, nearly died from toxic shock syndrome. Watts, in his attempt to take Mid-South wrestling to a bigger level, hired Fritz Booker, Ken Mantell, who then raided much of Fritz's top talent, including the Freebirds and Chris Adams, which resulted in a lawsuit going in the other direction. However, Watts was out of the wrestling business before the suit could go to trial. The kids, who were huge celebrities to younger kids, began ruining their reputation in their own territory. Local promoters and sponsors by either showing up incoherent or no-showing wrestling and public appearances. Another Von Erich was brought in, Lance, who looked like a model but couldn't wrestle a lick. Real name Kevin William Vaughn, Lance was billed as the son of Waldo, and thus the first cousin of the boys. However, when cousin Lance jumped to a rival promotion in Dallas, Fritz went on television and gruffly stated that not only was he not a cousin after telling people that he was for a few years, but what his real name was, and how he would take legal steps to make sure he never used the name Von Erich because he had the name trademarked. Mike's disease took its toll on him both physically and mentally. He was still put back in the ring and pushed as if he was a superstar. Kerry was in a motorcycle wreck in June of 1986, which he was lucky to live through. He came back too soon because business was bad and they felt they needed him back in the ring for a major show, and the saddest part of all was that this big return only drew 2,326 fans, and resulted in worsening of the healing process before his leg properly healed and had to have his foot secretly amputated. Kevin nearly died in the ring, passing out and needing CPR from Tommy Rogers to save him. Mike was arrested a few times before finally killing himself with a drug overdose at the age of 23. The promotion first tried to come up with a storyline with the idea that Mike was kidnapped and foul play was suspected in an attempt to hide the suicide, but word spread in the legit media faster than they could get their angle over. Fritz, through Bruiser Brody as an intermediary, signed a talent deal for his sons and his company to the tune of $250,000 per year from New Japan Pro Wrestling, switching their affiliation from All Japan, a deal that raised some eyebrows because of what was believed everything Baba did for him in the wake of the death of David. After Jim Crockett basically took over the NWA and made it difficult for other promoters to get good dates on Flair, without cutting Crockett in for a piece, Fritz pulled out and created his own world-class heavyweight title, which Kevin and Kerry were to be the mainstays of. However, the local fans never took that championship as a serious world title, so the big drawing world title matches that had been the hallmark of the territory were no more. Fritz had tastelessly built a show around David's death, the annual David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions dating back to the 1984 Texas Stadium show, the first few of which drew big crowds, and after Mike's death had it renamed the David and Mike Show, and a combination of worsening talent and promotion and lack of taste put the crowd back in the ballpark of when Fritz had his own retirement match. With the promotion on its last legs, Fritz did his final wrestling angle, on a Christmas night show at Reunion Arena, being attacked by several heels and faking his own heart attack, although the term heart attack was never used after the first weekend after the angle, and near death, playing on the sympathy area fans had from the real deaths of two of his children. Even the most callous wrestling promoters at the time couldn't believe he'd go to such lengths, particularly since his condition as updated each week on television would improve and degrade based on the Friday Night House. If they drew a big house on television, they'd say Fritz was getting better. If the house was down, suddenly Fritz's condition had gotten worse. The angle did revitalize a dying promotion over the short haul, but a few months later, he finally got out of the wrestling business. He largely lived a life alone in his final years. Chris, who wanted to be like Kerry but was only 5'5" with below average athletic ability, killed himself at the age of 21 in 1991. Chris, who was heavily into the drug scene, more than any of the brothers, wanted to be a wrestler, but wasn't physically equipped. When he was a small teenager, he did an angle where he tackled Gino Hernandez as he tried to run away from a head shaving after losing a famous double hair versus double hair match with Chris Adams against Kevin and Kerry at Texas Stadium before more than 25,000 fans. After a short time in the ring, a combination of ring injuries and problems with asthma made it impossible for him to continue, and unable to cope with it, he shot himself in the head. His wife Doris divorced him in 1992, blaming him for all the family problems. Finally, in 1993, Kerry, shortly after losing his job with the WWF over drug problems where he was billed as the Texas Tornado with his Von Erich name and Iron Claw downplayed, on probation for forging drug prescriptions, had cocaine found in his rent-a-car. Fearing the probation violation would send him to prison and ruin whatever hadn't been completely tarnished of his manufactured image, Kerry went to his ex-wife and told her that he would kill himself unless she promised to get back with him. She wouldn't promise to get back with him, and on February 17, 1993, he shot himself in the throat, thus for the most part ending the Von Erich legacy in the ring. Some wrestling fans called it the Von Erich curse, or incredible bad luck, but that would be ignoring a pattern of messages sent out loud and clear. Perhaps the only luck was Kevin's, having survived his tumultuous youth and upbringing, at least one public death scare, and getting totally out of the wrestling business. There were too many incidents for it to be random bad luck. It was a family and the wrestling industry in one part of the country destroyed by a combination of drugs and a life of having all your transgressions covered up to the point one feels immune to having to deal inwardly with problems. Then when problems come that can't be covered up, with no experience at dealing with it, people tried to escape from them, first with more drugs, and then escape from life. Fritz pushed his first 3 kids to stardom before they were ready. As much as it worked for the public, they couldn't handle the pressures that come with celebrityhood at a young age. But in at least some cases, it wasn't a life they wanted, but a life they felt duty-bound to lead. His next son was pushed totally beyond his element, and the final son grew up with the idea of where he was going to end up, but unfortunately that wasn't his destiny. While Fritz would outwardly deny and not accept when his lieutenants would call attention to the drug problems, he still provided them with a doctor who would get them whatever they wanted in whatever quantity they wanted. The only brother still alive, Kevin, now 40, a superstar in the business before the age of 25, who seemed to lose his interest in wrestling in the mid-80s, wasn't wrestling much before Kerry died, and wrestled sparingly after Kerry's death, and has been out of the wrestling business for several years now. Neither the WWF nor WCW acknowledged the death of Atkinson on their flagship Monday night television shows, although Dusty Rhodes did mention Fritz Von Erich on WCW Saturday Night, noting that Von Erich had given him his first break in pro wrestling. Jack Atkinson was admitted by Baylor Medical Center on July 25 after a mild stroke. Upon examination, doctors found cancer that had started from his lungs, had spread to his brain and adrenal gland. At that point, it became little more than a sad waiting game. The Reader's Pages. October 20, 1997. Even though I get a few of those free online so-called wrestling newsletters every day telling me the so-called latest wrestling news, I can't tell you how much I value the Observer. I get a lot of news. Most of it is just plain wrong, from the internet, but you always seem to have a lot of news they just don't have. More important, I can rely on the Observer to put the news into context. I truly believe that the future in the news business belongs not to those who merely provide the news but to those who put it into context, and you do that extremely well. I also believe the future of internet wrestling newsletters is not going to belong to the 13-year-old idiots who are, for the most part, publishing them now, often simply stealing from you and your hotline or printing the most outlandish and idiotic stuff one can imagine. These newsletters are also hurt by their incessant internecine feuding as well as the belief that they are actually important and that people depend on them for the news. I was reminded of the value of the Observer along with the lack of value of internet newsletters when I read the Fritz von Erich obituary, even though I thought your story was too kind to him. Talk about the personification of evil. He, in essence, murdered 3 or 4 of his own sons. I don't think you could ever have been too harsh on such a man. I realize your intent was to report on his life and death, but I thought he got off easy. Having said that, let me also say it was an incredible piece of journalism, not wrestling journalism, but journalism. It was multi-layered, capturing not only the essence of the man but of his times and his career. It is this type of journalism that will keep readers coming back to publications like yours even when we have faster access to news than ever before through the internet, even though you regularly scoop them on the news. Fair, tough, impartial, comprehensive reporting is what we have come to expect from you and what we get every week. But sometimes you pull off a piece like the von Erich obit, on deadline, and we value the Observer even more. Name withheld by request. October 27, 1997. This morning I went to my video collection and watched the Fritz von Erich vs. Giant Baba match from December 3, 1966. This was the match that was the first sellout at Budokan Hall. After 30 years, it shows von Erich at his best. This prototype of all monster heels kicked like Bruiser Brody, and his Iron Claw, ridiculed by Danny Hodge and misused by pretty boy faces in the 80s, had 16,000 Japanese worrying that their national idol's head would be crushed. Smelling blood, he threw officials and fans around like stacks of old newspapers. What Steve Austin is today, Fritz von Erich did in the 50s. We can criticize his hypocritical personal life and debate his failings as a promoter, but let's not forget that Jack Atkinson was a great pro wrestler. The story of Fritz introducing his 3 sons at the NWA convention as future world champions sounds ridiculous now, but you have to remember it had already been done and done successfully by Dory Funk. What might have been the difference is that Dory Jr. and Terry grew up with beer and rednecks in Amarillo while the Von Erichs grew up with more sophisticated people and hard drugs in Dallas. I enjoyed the IWF pay-per-view and gave it a thumbs up. The big winners were the pro wrestlers, Frank Shamrock, Matt Hume, and Tsuyoshi Kosaka. Maybe the Brazilians have the greatest fighting style, but who can wait around for 2 hours for a finish? Doesn't it seem like if you've seen one Brazilian fight, you've seen them all? The wrestlers are the best athletes and I love watching them maneuver on the mat, but amateur wrestling style was intentionally made incomplete to avoid injury. Tom Erickson can't think or adjust on the mat, and from watching him against Kosaka and Bustamante, he's a long way from being the best. There is no need for a cage at this event. It was used to restrict movement and as a tool for leverage. A large wrestling mat with 3 circles could be used. The middle circle could be the wrestling area. The area within the second circle would be colored to warn the contestants they are nearing the outer edge. The third circle would be out of bounds and if any part of the wrestler entered the ref would have to stop the action, stand them up, and restart in the middle. He could allow them to continue if a finish was at hand or a wrestler was using the rules to force a deliberate break. This would eliminate people laying on the cage with nothing happening and all the bad press and PR that goes with an event held inside a cage. A mat would tell people there is a difference between this and UFC. Another problem is that the event didn't build to anything, but I hope we see more pay-per-view shows like it. Steve Yohei. Montebello, California. Upon reading your excellent autobiography on the late Fritz von Erich, I just thought I'd voice a few thoughts. I was never a fan of the Von Erichs or world-class wrestling because I found the whole thing wasn't what it was made up to be. The Von Erichs exposed themselves in full daylight as soon as they stepped into the ring. I don't mean to knock them, but to me they always lacked believability. How people would go nuts as Kerry would have Ric Flair in a sleeper and the camera zoomed in to show the immense air pockets of the hold is beyond me. Kevin was just plain annoying to watch. I remember a former opponent once telling me Kevin would be stuffed just because he could get away with it. Their opponents also noticeably had to always hold back. You also touched upon Fritz's born-again background. I myself am born again, and to set the record straight, that term isn't an insincere euphemism for a con artist. It denotes a personal relationship with the Creator, Jesus Christ. What Fritz tried to hide from the public was proof positive that, like the book says, you reap what you sow, which is something Fritz should have known. I feel terribly sorry for them, but it sure makes you think. Mike Migelotti. Vilpula, Finland. Once in a while you write a story that should go down in wrestling journalism history as well studied and documented. A prize-winning article. You outdid yourself in the story on Fritz von Erich. These are the articles I have my non-wrestling fans read. I remember watching Fritz when I was 9 years old and his wrestling matches are still alive in my memory. When World Class used to wrestle in San Antonio in the 80s, they attracted every teeny bopper alive. One match that featured David, Originally scheduled for Kerry against Ric Flair, the upper level was opened at the Hemisphere Arena. This was the only time the upper level had been opened for a wrestling match. It's a shame what happened to this family. We had an almost similar story here in San Antonio, except in boxing. The Ayala father also pushed his sons into boxing from an early age. They had their drug problems and one son is now in prison for rape. I guess the lesson here is not to live your life through your kids. Jesse Reyes. San Antonio, Texas. This is ridiculous. The September 22nd issue spent 4.5 pages on the death of Fritz von Erich. What the hell am I paying for? I can understand a half page, even a page, but 4.5 pages? It's time to speak up. I ignored the issue with the story about some dead roller derby lady. This was the final straw. I get this newsletter because it's the best. I've tried all the others and it's the best. But if you're going to keep this up every time somebody dies, you're going to lose readers. Nobody cares about a lengthy story surrounding a wrestler's death. If we don't already know about their career after they die, isn't the time to start educating us? Simply tell us that the guy died, what names he wrestled under, and a few quick facts about his career. It's hypocritical to go any deeper and not paying for that crap much longer. John Cashmere. Burlington, New Jersey. Your story on the Von Erich family should have been written for a broader audience. Huge kudos for a masterful examination of a tragic family. I sadly shook my head reading about how Fritz rushed Kerry back from the motorcycle accident for 2,200 fans. Death of a Dynasty and Betsy Sherman's Blood Sport are two of the best efforts in wrestling journalism ever. The two pieces peel away the layers of a unique business to display ills that float like ghosts whose ignorance will dig more early graves. Kevin Donlin. Pasadena, Maryland. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to